Which one is yours?
My one's the bottom one.
Bottom one?
Or the second bottom.
This one?
The PDF one. There, yeah.
Okay.
So just check that no one's name. Yeah, I want to get rid of that.
Which one do you want to get rid of?
These two names.
Who did you send it to? Oh. This is actually live right now.
I shouldn't have put his names in.
Oh, okay. I see it. Oh, that's his.
Should I test it?
Outside is a vending machine.
Hello, we're going to get started very shortly. Please have a seat.
You think this carries outside?
Hi everyone! We're gonna get started right away. Musical chairs, 15 seats are missing.
Cluck, cluck. Hello.
Good presentation. I love your energy. It's like a professional, academic, technical conference. Did Eric say that?
He was pointing out that we're streaming video here, so why is there no pictures?
Audience.
Take pictures of the screen.
I guess it's okay.
We're blowing the battery from the bus. I know where I got it.
I'm easy. I don't have slides or anything.
I don't want to be here. I don't know if you want to.
Not interested. Opting out of that.
So we've got, what does this ticker mean? It just ended.
Some more energy?
I've got a countdown here.
Pinar just said.
Welcome back.
Just
Grab a
ask
seat.
questions. Don't say
Hi guys,
anything else.
welcome back.
I'm going to introduce Andrew, and then we're just going to go, and then she's going to do an announcement about the whips in between. So, but yeah.
About the whips.
Work in progress. Yes, we shall have people on.
Yeah. Should I announce?
They're supposed to be on that screen. Of course. It's important. Down there. I'm Victoria. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation.
But yeah, good call. I will keep that in mind.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
yeah, we ready?
Hey guys, we're about 6 minutes over now, if we can. I mean, this is eating into lunch, I guess. I'm not going to shorten my talk for your sake, but the sooner we sit down, the sooner we can get started. The title? What is it? Security assumptions, I guess.
Cool. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Polstra, who's going to be talking to us about security incentives.
Cool. So I've got a timer here. Should this be starting? A little device? That's fine. 10:47. Okay. Hi guys. I'm Andrew Polstra. I'm a developer for the libsecp256k1 project, which is a library that does the underlying sort of traditional cryptography in Bitcoin. So I'm going to talk to you guys a bit about security assumptions, security models, trust models, and stuff. And so to try to give you guys a high-level overview of how we ought to be thinking about these sorts of problems of scaling and efficiency and decentralization and stuff. Because Bitcoin ultimately is a crypto system. It is the entirety of Bitcoin. It's not just like the digital signatures. It's not just the script system. It's not just proof of work or anything. Everything about Bitcoin is a crypto system, and it needs to be designed sort of with a security mindset, which means, I guess, the buzzword that we like to use is adversarial thinking. So when we design Bitcoin, we want things to be working even in an adversarial setting, which is sort of an unfamiliar mode of thinking, I think, probably for most people and probably for most areas of research. So as an example that a friend of mine likes to use on IRC, you can imagine asking a building designer or like a structural engineer to say, well, I want you to design this building, and it needs to be structurally sound, in the case of like weird weather, strong winds, hurricanes, heavy rains and stuff. And then also, if anybody studies your plans in detail and deliberately tries to destroy your building, it shouldn't be heard. And that's just not feasible. That can't be done in real life. That can't be done for most systems. And even where it can be done, it's not practical. It's just incredibly expensive to build things that are secure against just outlandish attack scenarios. And usually we try to, this is why we have legal infrastructure in place. A lot of society is sort of built around preventing adversarial behavior because it's so difficult to intrinsically prevent. However, in cryptography, we don't have these benefits. we're working online, especially in Bitcoin, where a lot of things are anonymous or pseudonymous, or at least difficult to trace, where anybody can connect to anybody and basically do anything. And if it's possible to hurt the system adversarially, then somebody will be able to do it from somewhere in the world. We can't just sort of assume that, they'll be visible or they'll be caught or something. Okay? So to give an example of this sort of adversarial thinking, let me talk briefly about a bug that we had in libsec v256k1 about 3 or 4 months ago. And this was a very technical bug. What it was is that we had a problem with our group addition formula. That was this problem, we don't know, well, I know that it cannot be exploited with the interface that we had back then. It was basically not a usable bug for attackers, at least at the time. And it was extremely difficult to hit. What it was is that for roughly 1 in every 2 to the 128 inputs to our group addition function, the addition will be wrong. So what I mean by that is that for every single point on our curve, there exist 2 other points, such that if you add this point and one of its 2 bad points, you will just get the wrong answer. Okay? And what this means is that the higher level crypto system is going to give you the wrong answer, something that a signature that should be correct isn't correct, or something that should be verifying isn't verifying, or something. And this is incredibly rare. You can't hit this by accident. Well, you can't hit it just by chance, I guess. And all of the systems that we have sort of, or all of our existing crypto systems that we use, put random inputs into this, assuming all is well. So you might think we could sort of ignore this bug, we could pretend this didn't happen. But because we are, this is a cryptographic tool, and we can't predict how people are going to use this in the future, we can't predict what kind of extensions, we realized that we had to fix this bug. And we, our initial solution was it was a big hit in terms of efficiency. This would have cost us like an extra 50% in signature production, I think, or verification. And then over time, we managed to get that down from 50% then to 25%, and then to 8, and then 3, I think, is where we finally landed. We were actually very surprised that it was possible to fix this. But at no point did we say, hey, this is really hard to hit. This will never, ever happen by chance. And in our existing system, you can't hit it, so let's just not fix it. That's just not, we can't think that way, because if we think that way, what will happen is that we'll have like an addition formula that's wrong for a certain class of inputs we believe we can't hit. And then one day in the future, we'll add another crypto system that uses this as a primitive. Well, I've forgotten that, hey, wait a minute, our addition is secretly not addition. It's addition with this caveat that never mattered until now. And then something bad will go wrong. So this is what adversarial thinking gets you. And so this is sort of difficult enough in traditional cryptography, where the assumptions that we make when we're thinking adversarially are pretty uncontroversial. For something like ECDSA signatures, we're thinking, the assumptions we require are things like, well, every participant has to be at most like a polynomial time probabilistic Turing machine, or maybe like a quantum Turing machine. And then that's pretty uncontroversial. I mean, we have a lot of physical evidence this is true. And then secondly, we say, well, a couple like specific mathematical problems should be very difficult to solve. So one is like the discrete log assumption. And this is probably not too controversial to say this is probably not possible with a probabilistic polynomial time computer. We know that it is with a quantum computer, so I guess the clock is ticking on that. But these are the assumptions we're making. And with these very simple, at least easy to formulate, and I hope very believable assumptions, we then have to do this adversarial thinking mode, and we find that things are actually very difficult and very technical. However, in Bitcoin, we, in addition to having this is sort of the boring part of Bitcoin, script verification and stuff. This is the stuff that nobody even thinks about, because it sort of just works. I mean, we complain sometimes that it's maybe not as expressive as we want, but it just works. What's novel in Bitcoin is this proof of work scheme, this mining scheme. And what this is there for, I guess, is as a way to develop a consensus on the ordering of transactions, so we can detect double spends. And we want it to be a distributed consensus, or a decentralized consensus. And the reason is that there are some problems that miners solve that are sort of intrinsically impossible to solve cryptographically. So one is simply that we can't cryptographically enforce that they never shut down, right? If they just pack up and go home, then the system stops. So we sort of want them to keep going. Another thing is censorship resistance. It's impossible cryptographically to prove that a miner is aware of something and then did not put it into a block. Simply this proving awareness thing is sort of conceptually difficult. It's conceptually impossible to prove mathematically. So again, we want incentives for miners to include transactions, but then we want to balance that without creating incentives for miners to create fake transactions and fill their blocks with this, right? So, and then finally, there is this notion of double spending. What miners are there for is to prevent double spending. So we want them to all sort of agree to extend the same history and then to not be deliberately forking it, and even to not be accidentally forking it. And a lot of Bitcoin's design is to sort of enforce these things, because these are the things that we can't do cryptographically. And the last one is maybe the most sort of the weirdest one, sort of the fifth postulate of security thinking, where it appears that there is no universal time. There's no way to get a universal clock. And so what we do, we do this giant proof of work thing, and we sort of say, well, we're going to take our universal clock to be induced from the block ordering of the longest block, of the chain that the most people have put the most work into, I guess. And so all these things are, we can't do it cryptographically, so we add these extra assumptions. We add incentive structures, I guess, that will hopefully induce people to do the right thing. And this is how Bitcoin is designed. And then on top of this, so this is already very difficult. So now I want to remind you guys that we still need to think adversarially about this. And I'm glad I didn't realize this when I set up this talk, but the next speaker's talk has the title, what is it? In an adversarial setting, blockchains don't scale. And so I guess this talk will sort of serve as an introduction to this. So we have these problems already. The reason that Bitcoin is so slow is that we want this decentralization, and we want decentralization in these properties that we can't really cryptographically enforce. Okay? So it's easy to do things like decentralized signature verification, right? Or decentralized creating correct signatures, because you create a signature, anybody who wants to verify that it's correct can just verify it. Decentralizing things like time ordering is not so easy, and that's how we have all this mining and stuff. And so when we talk about, I guess scaling Bitcoin, we talk, most frequently we care about this speed problem, this throttling problem, this throughput problem. So a lot of people like to, for example, compare Bitcoin's throughput to that of Visa's. But nobody else says, hey, wait a minute, what if we just replace Bitcoin with Visa? So it's sort of this intuitive understanding that we can't just take all of this infrastructure we created to avoid these central single points of failure or censorship risk or shutdown risk or anything. We can't just throw them out. But there's still this desire to somehow move toward something faster, with better throughput, with better sort of efficiency. And it's important that we make this explicit. This is what we're doing. Okay? Because if we go so far, so I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of scalability proposals for Bitcoin sort of change the security model, change the trust model, change the dynamic at least. And so one example of that I want to talk about, if I do have time. One example that I should mention briefly is a segregated witness thing that another speaker is going to describe. And what segregated witness is a way of splitting off transaction signatures from transaction data in blocks. And this allows verifiers, so people just reading the blockchain trying to make sure it's correct, to make a conscious decision for every single transaction, whether they want to verify that that transaction is correct, that the transaction signature is correct, that it's properly formed as a valid digital signature, satisfies the script however it's supposed to. For each transaction, they can choose whether or not to do that, or they can choose to just sort of trust that if it got into a block, then full verifiers would have complained about it, right? And so they're sort of trusting that the rest of the network, or at least the miner who produced the block that they're doing, made sure that the signature was correct. And so segregated witness sort of lets us have this really fine-grained trade-off, like per transaction in a given block. Say, do we want so-called SPV security, where we're trusting the miners, we're trusting the proof of work to indicate that the transaction is correct, or do we want full cryptographic security, where we're checking every single thing, and we're making sure that all the math. So I chose this example because it's a very explicit, very, very granular trade-off, I guess. But most scaling proposals in Bitcoin are like this. We have a few that are just, I guess, net wins. We do stuff like work on improving the cryptography, work on improving the underlying algorithm. Sometimes we can get like a net win. But these net wins are like, small, like 5, 10%, maybe 20, 30%. These are not dramatic things that are going to allow Bitcoin to scale beyond, I guess, current transaction throughput numbers substantially, or not qualitatively, I should say. If Bitcoin can handle, 5 times as many transactions as it can handle today, that'll be pretty awesome, but it's not going to, that's not a game changer at all. When people talk about being unable to do things because of Bitcoin's throughput, what they mean is that we need sort of orders of magnitude more transaction. The ability to verify orders of magnitude is more transactions. And for these kinds of things, these are where we need to change our security assumptions, and we need to change our trust models. And I guess the point of this talk, circling back to the beginning, is that when we do this, we have to remember that the security thing, the security model, the trust model, are cryptographic, I guess, or they should be thought of cryptographically. They should be thought of with an adversarial mindset. Because even though we can't verify them cryptographically, they are still security assumptions. And we still have to think adversarially. We can't be saying things like, oh, you know, this will almost never happen, you know, or this will never happen, you know, or most transactions are structured where this part of the transaction is purely random and they're just never going to hit this weird edge case, or something like that. Or you can't say, oh, well, unless this group of people all colludes in the following way, we'll all be fine. Bitcoin works in an adversarial setting. If there are failure modes that can be found somehow, that can be targeted, they will be targeted. And this is true. This is almost not worth saying, or this is almost something we never explicitly say in traditional cryptography because it's so ingrained, it's so old. But when we move from these traditional cryptographic assumptions, which are like hard computational problems and stuff, into this more nebulous region where we're thinking about incentives and I guess economic things and trust things, and what are people going to do, how are people going to collude, what do people want to do, what will people make money if they do, what will they lose money if they do, this sort of stuff. These are traditionally the domain of more, I guess, more traditional ways of thinking, right? Ways of thinking where you assume that, you know, people know each other, or at least subconsciously you assume people know each other, people won't try to screw each other, people have reasons not to screw each other, there will be some sort of legal infrastructure, there will be some sort of consequence. This is not the world that Bitcoin lives in. We're solving the same sorts of problems, but now we're having to bring these very difficult requirements on our modes of thinking into these much more nebulous areas. And this is why these problems are so difficult. I mean, this is why we're having these conferences. This is why there's, I guess, any controversy at all in this space, is that these problems are hard, and they're not only hard to solve, but they can be hard to think about as well. And I don't know how much time I have. Oh, I guess about 5 minutes. So that is the meat of my talk. So let me move on to almost the second topic, was just this. Oh, okay. Never mind. All right, sorry, I'm reading that clock. This is 5 minutes. All right, if I have no time to wrap up, I'm not going to go to my second subject, which is basically trying to motivate decentralization and talk about decentralization of miners and validators, which are two sort of distinct entities. And sometimes their incentives do not line up, and this adds sort of another layer of complexity to this. That we've got multiple participants with potentially different incentives, and this restricts our ability to develop solutions to these sorts of things. And yeah, I guess that's all I have time to say. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions?
Let's take questions. Over here.
Regarding decentralization, what proposals do I guess are better and which are worse from an adversarial standpoint?
So I guess a solution that would not be great from an adversarial standpoint would be something like, hey, how about we replace these mining with like a signal signature? How about we just have like some authority who decides the ordering of blocks and signs things? And this is bad from an adversarial perspective, because not only do you now have sort of one entity who's able to compromise the ordering of transactions himself, now he's a target. So now any people who want to attack the system will have a single thing to target, and that would be bad, right? That would greatly increase the risk that something would go wrong. Whereas something like, for example, the Lightning proposal, that does change the trust model, but does so sort of locally, I guess. So individual transactors now have the ability to individually decide to what degree they are trusting each other not to double spend. And they also, they also get to have a fallback, where if things go wrong, they then have this rollback option, which is a bit more expensive and stuff. And so that's much better from an adversarial setting, both because you avoid the single point of failure risk, and because the failure mode is much more controlled, because it sort of reduces to Bitcoin.
So you allude to the prior assumptions of trust in some of these, the ways that we've previously thought. What are some frameworks that we can use to approach the different social assumptions of Bitcoin as we're designing these new systems?
So I guess what you're asking is, can I enumerate some different trust models and how Bitcoin fits into this? More approaches, I guess. Okay. So the Bitcoin trust model, I guess, what we would hope is sort of one in which, at least for transaction ordering censorship resistance, we have sort of miners all over the world sort of individually sort of fighting for the next block. And so there's you don't have this sort of clustering, you don't have any of these single point of failure or single targets, I guess. In fact, what appears to actually have happened in the Bitcoin space is we have a lot more clustering, we have a lot more centralization in the mining world than we would maybe like if our goal is decentralization. So things that approach this is something where we could, for example, rather than having a single entity like a bank or a clearinghouse deciding which transactions go through, you could have like a federation, for example, where you have like some fixed group of like 10 or 100 people, whatever, and you need like a majority of them to agree or something. And so that's obviously, that's not like decentralization what we want, but it is sort of a cheap approximation, which maybe is sufficient in some scenarios, although certainly not for what Bitcoin does. But that's an example of an approximation, I guess.
Okay, next question over there.
So we have an IRC question. The question is, how do you think about security assumptions on cryptographic protocol layer assumptions? So the security model of underlying security primitives is mature enough, but protocol layer may be changed, and we should care about attacks there, a la attacks that you see on TLS and other IETF protocols.
Oh, I really like that question. So what do I think about this? I'm going to answer that instead of giving a real answer to the question. What I think is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. A lot of tooling and ways of thinking need to we need to sort of radically change the way that we design these protocols. Because right now, basically, protocols are developed, they're laid out, they're written out and specified, and we've sort of expected that everybody follow them more or less. And we try to design ways to make sure that even by violating the protocol, bad things can't happen. But what we would like is a way to sort of computationally verify that the protocol is resilient against failures like this. And I've seen a few papers about this. The one that I read just yesterday was this paper called Session Types for Rust, which is a way of using a strong typing system in a language such as Rust or Haskell or ML or something to basically describe your protocol in a way that when you actually go to implement it, the compiler will prevent you from accidentally violating the protocol or for violating in very egregious ways. And then using things like that, you're then able to sort of prove that you've implemented the protocol correctly and you avoid things. Well, the dream is you can avoid things like Heartbleed because your code won't compile if you have these weird failure modes. So tools like that are the stuff that we need to be developing, and we are. And there's been a lot of progress in this area. It's very exciting. Is there anything else?
I think that's it. Before we introduce the next speaker, we have a quick reminder. If you're interested in giving a work in progress talk, please sign up before lunch is over, and you can find a link for this on the official Scaling Bitcoin Twitter feed. Thank you, Andrew. That was great.
Thanks,
Thank our speaker.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Todd, and we'll speak about in adversarial environments, blockchains don't scale.
Where is this? There you go.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk on half of what I would have gone and spoken about. So that's actually very convenient and really helpful. That was very useful. I'm going to go start with talking really about one of these sort of nitty-gritty applications of where adversarial thinking is relevant to incentives around decentralization. And, I think there are many different issues with increasing block sizes, but this is kind of one of the immediate ones that kind of limits us in an environment where everyone has all the data. And you know, when I go and say scale, I mean, remember, we're talking about can we go get many orders of magnitude improvement, not, you know, can we get 5, can we get 10 times, but rather, do we have a system that has fundamentally different scaling characteristics? And I think this will show that if everyone has all the data, we potentially have issues. So in my little scenario here, we can imagine a blockchain apparently recently started with 3 blocks, and we have Chinese miners and the US miners. And if China finds the next block, well, they're behind the Great Firewall of China, which I had the pleasure of interfacing with last week, and I can tell you it's rather slow to get any data across. And it's quite likely, before the US side even learns about China's new block, that they're going to go find another block. And the problem pretty much comes down to, well, who's going to find the next block after that? Who's going to win the tie? And depending on how the hashing power is distributed, it'll be China, and eventually both sides come to consensus and they learn about each other's blocks. Now, this is a pretty well-known feature of Bitcoin. This is how the system works, but there's a very big catch here, which is, what's interesting is when you talk about this in terms of incentives, in terms of kind of failure modes, which is you might ask, well, what percentage of hashing power does the Chinese side in this example need for them to come out ahead, as in for them to go earn more money than the other side? And you can do the math on this, and it turns out to be certainly 50% and probably about 30%, which is really interesting, because then you can kind of ask the question, well, hang on, if I'm behind the Great Firewall of China and I don't happen to bother making my internet connection better to the rest of the world, do I have an incentive to improve the situation? It's not really clear that you do in many scenarios, which now means, hang on, if I'm not in China, how do I get into the mining game? How do I go add to the decentralization of Bitcoin? You know, what's the long-term progression of this? It could very well be a scenario where once you kind of bump up to these limits, hashing power is going to end up being in one place because that's what's most profitable. And, you know, we've gone and done a lot of work. Matt Corallo's Relay Network is a great example where we go and essentially use compression techniques to compress blocks, pre-propagate the data, pre-propagate the transactions, and when a block's actually found, rather than sending the whole block, you simply send a list of transactions, say the block contains this transaction, this transaction, this transaction, and very quickly distribute everything. Now, in normal circumstances, this would work really well, but this is Bitcoin, this is adversarial thinking. If I'm the miner off in China, it might be in my advantage to make sure the relay network doesn't work. Because if I'm going to get my blocks to more than 30%, and I'm not thinking in terms of higher level issues such as maybe the harm to the Bitcoin price or so on, I'm just thinking about how much money I'm going to make next week, next month, I don't necessarily want the relay network to work because that helps my competitors. You know, this is an example where in an adversarial environment, something that would otherwise work really well doesn't scale. And as we've alluded to before, currently the distribution of hashing power is fairly lopsided. Although I'll make the point that these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt because, of course, something bad happens. We're currently still in a situation where it's very easy to start new pools. So, you know, I'm not actually that worried about that graph. I'd be much more worried about that graph if it didn't change every once in a while. And I think this is from September, and you'll notice the order of who's on top's changed. So if we're going to go talk about, well, how can we go scale this thing? I mean, we could start talking about existing theory and databases. You know, ultimately Bitcoin, one way to look at it is just a big unspent coin database. And as with most computer science, I'll put a tree on it, and you can imagine all the coins in the system in this database, and I can find every coin by its unique identifier. And when I go spend a coin, I'm updating an entry in the database. You know, and this looks much like standard database applications. I mean, you can imagine a customer database, personnel database, a bunch of numbered people. And this all works very well, and if the number of items in my database gets too big, well, I can go start sharding it. I can go and split up the key space. In this case, I have 4 different servers running it. If I need to make modification, obviously I just go to the server responsible for that part of the key space. I do whatever I need to do and so on. And normally in databases, this works really well. It's a very valid scenario. But what's interesting is asking, why is this hard in Bitcoin? And this really comes down to, well, what are we using Bitcoin for? Well, we're doing transactions. Transactions aren't unknown, contrary to maybe what many of the Bitcoin people would like to say in terms of blockchain tech. Most databases actually have transactions under the hood. And that's how you get consistency and rollback and so on. Well, in Bitcoin, the transaction graph is probably the most important thing. And as we build on blocks, well, we take coins and we spend them and create new coins, and so on and so forth. Sometimes coins are merged together. Sometimes they're split apart. And the system progresses. Now, if you went and sharded that database, split it across that key space, obviously this can work. When I would make a transaction, I would go to the various parts of the Bitcoin ecosystem that hold my coin and say, hey, I want to go spend it. Please commit it to this new part, and I'll make a new coin come into existence in that part of the database. In a standard system, this would work really well. The problem is, Bitcoin has this issue where the data in the database depends on earlier data. Now, here, if I have one single invalid transaction, that very first red Bitcoin, if you will, its act on the rest of the data is viral in the sense that everything after it is now invalid. And if my definition of a blockchain is everything in it's valid, now I'm in a scenario where if I try to split up this database, I'm trusting other people to do the right thing. I'm potentially trusting, in an adversarial environment, other Bitcoin miners to not create fake money. And as an aside, I've actually done a lot of work, fintech work for banks and so on, advising them about their architectures. And I think what's really interesting is how when they go look at blockchains, even though they're in an environment where they have the law on their side, where everyone knows who everyone is, where if something goes wrong, you can go call up a person and say, hey, let's go fix this. The smarter clients, they're actually pretty terrified of blockchains, because even in that kind of very benign environment compared to Bitcoin, if something goes wrong, it's not really clear how to roll back. If you go find out after the fact that one of your counterparties at another bank screwed up, and now there's $1 million of fake money, it isn't an easy thing to fix. And if you actually look at how banking works right now, even though they technologically could have done blockchains for quite a long time, they don't. They go use systems where, if I'm going to go and transact with you, I'll go have a correspondent bank account. And preventing a double spend is now that bank's problem. It's all localized. If something goes wrong, it's localized. Bitcoin doesn't have this property because we have transactions. And this makes applying conventional thinking very, very difficult. I would go as far to make the claim, in an adversarial environment, I can't scale this by splitting it up. We need better technology for that. Which really gets us to, well, what solutions do we have? As alluded to earlier, Lightning is a great example of a system that helps scalability by limiting the kind of trust you're involved. In something like the Lightning system, if I'm going to send money through another node, yes, there's trust involved, but it's piecewise trust. If that trust is broken, I wait a while for the timeouts to trigger and I eventually get my money back, but the whole ecosystem as a whole isn't infected by this mistake. Mistakes aren't built upon one another, and you're always going back to the simple, easy to verify consensus blockchain if something does go wrong. Similarly, systems like ChangeTip. Again, even simpler, but I trust ChangeTip with my money. I might not trust very much of it, but if something goes wrong, it's limited to ChangeTip. And these are all technological solutions that are very easy to implement and very clear that they work. They have flaws, but at least you're not risking an ecosystem-wide event if something goes wrong. Longer term, though, I think it would be nice if we could find ways to go scale up blockchains. And I'm not going to present these this stuff fully in depth, but one of the ideas that's kind of been out in the space is this notion that, well, maybe miners shouldn't validate. If miners don't validate and you allow invalid stuff in the chain, now you don't have these potential issues of I'm building on part of the blockchain and you're building on part of the blockchain and you screwed up, well now I'm harmed. One thing you can actually do is say, well, if I'm going to give you money, why don't I give you a proof that all the transactions, all the data in the blockchain, or that part of the blockchain, now that it can be split up, that corresponds to real money. And in this kind of system, it's certainly inconvenient. I can't just go say, well, trust that miner to ensure you have money. But if I go provide you the correct data, I can go prove to you very convincingly that yes, that money is real. Unfortunately, the most naive way to do it is this sort of quasi-exponential scaling. Because in a real economy, all the coins kind of merge together. You have very high rates of mixing. I know Gregory Maxwell did the work for me once and figured, you know, how quickly do coins mix? And essentially, going back maybe 6 months, pretty much every coin has been mixed with every other coin on the chain, because that's how rapidly the economy works. But we do have a trick up our sleeve. And we can linearize this history. Now, I'm sure the Snark guys are going to laugh at me when I explain how this is done, given how simplistic it is, but it's a good sign that it can be simple, which is going back again. So if I have that yellow coin there, the one I want to prove to you, if I ensure that all the inputs to that coin have actually been spent, have actually been recorded irrevocably, if I pick at random one of those inputs, I can put myself in a position where probabilistically, certainly some of the time I'll get away with creating a fake coin if I'm an adversary, as in I make a transaction where one real coin goes in and the other input doesn't actually exist. Half the time I'll pick the input that's real. Great, I've created money out of thin air. Half the time I pick the input that isn't real. I've now destroyed my money. You can do the math on this, and it's plausible to go from this crazy, exponential blow up to linear type of proof, where the amount of data I have to go give to you is linear in sort of the age of the system. The other trick you can go do is use inflation, in that if coins are getting created on occasion, well, newly created coins have no history. And if the proof crunches through and it happens to pick a newly created coin as input it's proving, I've now shortened the proof. And this gets to some sort of O1 scaling with an incredibly high constant. And finally, when you go to more clever math with snarks, well, now this becomes very easy, and potentially in the future we can go scale this way. And it's interesting, is what we've done is we've said, well, given how hard validation is in the adversarial environment, why don't we go let someone else do that validation? Why don't we let the person who actually cares whether or not their coin's real do the validation? Potentially this is the way forward. This is probably 5 years out, but we do have some hope there. And given we're, in theory, supposed to be giving proposals, my proposal is actually fairly simple, which is we wait and see. We should not make hasty steps to go and potentially push Bitcoin down into a new trust model. I would much rather see us make our baby steps. If we do a block size increase, great, but don't do a big one. Do something that's a small enough increase that it's still within the same kind of region that Bitcoin operates in right now. Take advantage of the true scaling tech that we can, and see what happens in a few years. So with that, thank you.
We'll take questions. Please raise your hand. I see 3. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, question about when you were talking about how sharding can't work because we need the whole history of the transactions. What are your thoughts on, say, then, if I'm not talking to the plausibility or the actual possibility of this actually working on Bitcoin, but what if instead of history of transactions you stored checkpoints of balances instead? Therefore, then you could shard more or less because you don't actually have the histories to worry about. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
That's actually a great idea, and I've proposed it quite seriously to fintech clients. I have a bunch of software that working towards doing things like that called proof chains. But the really key thing with that is those checkpoints. I mean, who created the checkpoints? Some trusted entity did ultimately. And in a banking environment, it's certainly easy to set up the right social infrastructure to create these checkpoints. In a decentralized environment, it's not really clear how to do this. And I think if we actually went down that path, for a while it would certainly work, but this becomes a target for censorship. It becomes a target for seizure. You know, whoever the hell has the authority to create a checkpoint, if I want to shut down the system, I go after them. And even if the response is, well, you go onto Reddit and kind of elect a new leader, that's probably enough to destabilize the system if done consistently. And equally, if that may happen to me by becoming one of the people verifying a checkpoint, I'm probably not going to want to do it. So I'm kind of hoping we're going to have math solutions to it. Snarks potentially, and the recursive variant have the ability to compute the checkpoints for you, but I certainly wouldn't want to just sign off and saying, yeah, trust me.
Question here in the back.
Peter, at the very beginning, you were talking about the relay networks, and one question is, wouldn't China be fighting the rest of the world, not just the U.S. in your example? And furthermore, don't you also have a prisoner's dilemma where China has to assume everyone else doesn't join the other side to get an advantage over their fellow Chinese miners?
Well,
so all I'm trying to say is it's a lot more complex than you gave it.
First of all, I'll point out that in my diagram, I'm pretending I'm incredibly ignorant of geopolitics. But, I mean, right now we actually are in a position where China has enough of a hash rate majority to go pull this off successfully. I think right now the numbers are they've got about 60% of the hash power. And in this sort of attack I mentioned, you only need 30%. The other interesting thing is that attack kind of just happens naturally in environments where there isn't a block size limit, because it is my incentive, of course, to process transactions for people and let people get their transaction through and make the system work. And without that limit, there's no clear point at which I should stop. You know, there's no clear definition of what spam is, for instance. And if I'm the guy with the most hashing power, or at least my blocks get to the most hashing power quickly, I'm going to end up earning more money naturally than the guys who have less. And I think that alone is enough to, over multiple economic cycles, cause centralization pressure, simply because if I have 1% of the hashing power, I'm going to earn less money than everyone else. You know, and I think we should design systems that try to even that out to the greatest degree possible.
So you mentioned this idea of client-side validation, where I prove that all the inputs are valid, but how would you in this scenario prove that the inputs have not been spent? Because proving the non-existence of a spending input requires basically the full chain, or is there a way around it?
So this gets into the nitty-gritty of how these systems work, and one way you can think about these systems is to think of it in terms of proof of publication. As in, I prove to you, as part of spending money, that I have published that spend in a way that everyone who might want to get that information can get it. And simultaneously, I prove to you that nobody else, including myself, has already published a spend of that transaction. And when you're trying to do this in a more scalable environment, you limit where that transaction can be published. So, for instance, a very simplistic model in my tree chains concept, for instance, I could literally just give you the part of that blockchain to go prove to you that it hasn't been double spent. Potentially with more sophisticated math like Snarks, I could give you a compact proof that no transaction exists that would have validly spent that coin from the time it was created to the time I claim it was spent. So a lot of detail there, and I think that's a good point, but I think we have potential solutions there.
Okay, question over IRC.
Someone's asking, when are you going to write the BIP for linearized coin history or tree chains?
Anyone want to go hire me? I mean, quite seriously, like, I think a lot of this stuff's very far out, and this is still a research project. It's not going to be something that's happens overnight. I think we're going to see Lightning deployed well before tree chains will be, but I'm interested in doing it and see how that goes.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, assuming at some point transaction with fee at price free transactions, you're talking about client-only validation and the person who cares validating it, but miners always care about their fees, right?
Well, that's one of the very hard things to go solve, I think. And You know, in the case of something like recursive snarks, this becomes very easy, where you simply say, well, now when I try to go pay a miner to go mine my transaction, I now have a fairly compact proof that yes, the money is real. If you don't use clever math, if you use very simplistic stuff, if I remember the numbers, you'd probably say have to give someone about 10 megabytes of data to prove the transaction's real, depending on how the system's set up economically. That's not exactly good, but it's not implausible that this could be done. You know, and essentially you would be giving the miner the proof that the money is real in the same way you'd give anyone else it. You know, in that sense, the miner is the client. And what's interesting about a system like this is you could very well have multiple currencies coexist on the same underlying platform, you know, which raises economic issues I don't think anyone's really thought through in detail. So be interested to see what people come up with there.
Question in the back here.
Peter, I want to understand your linear coin history proposal a little better, and it sounds to me a lot like colored coin validation, where you're tracing specific coins back and you only care about that path.
Yep.
Now, for that to work, is it the case that a transaction could be valid if it has invalid inputs, just the valid paths remain valid?
Yes, that's exactly it. In fact, what's interesting about a system like that is you can use this for privacy, where you deliberately attempt to go create invalid transaction, knowing that some of the time you'll get away with it, some of the time you won't. And one good thing about encouraging this is sort of institutionalizing the fraud, if you will. Can create a system that's more robust and that we actually exercise the code that handles that case. And like I say, I mean, if I'm not giving you that data, I have very, very good privacy. You know, if I go and have 2 coins and I go and simply ignore one of them and do a bit of magic to go create a fake proof, well, when I do get away with that fake proof, now I don't have to go prove to you where that other money came from, you know. And I think this is an interesting case where scaling naturally leads to privacy, simply because you can't have a system that scales where everyone has all the data.
We have one more question in the back.
Hey, I have a question. So, what do you think about using miners or the blockchain not to verify anything, but just to resolve disputes? So, I think Bitcoin NG, for example, uses something where you can basically put anything into the blockchain, and then people can submit proofs that a transaction was invalid, and then you use the miner's verification power just to resolve these disputes. And do you think that could aid scalability?
Yeah, that's been actually brought up in Bitcoin for quite a while now. Interestingly, that approach is kind of hinted in Satoshi's white paper, where he talks about SPV clients and says that they could receive alerts from their peers that a block is invalid. And it isn't a bad idea, but I'd point out it's a different security model than Bitcoin is, where you are relying on the existence of, you know, to get kind of technical, you're relying on the existence of a flood fill network, where you're expecting to have a pretty good chance of receiving notification that something's invalid. And that assumption's often not true. You know, I mean, if you came over to my apartment and I was feeling a bit mean, I might go and set up my Wi-Fi access point to go and limit your ability to reach the rest of the Bitcoin network. You know, I might go filter out every bit of fraud that you might want to see. You know, if I'm a large miner who's trying to go and create money out of thin air, you know, commit fraud in that way, I might run enough nodes on the Bitcoin network that's unlikely you're going to go find a node that's honest and would reveal that fraud. And, you know, without using very clever math, it's very difficult to prevent these kind of cases. And I think one of the big worries is, well, socially, what happens if we don't detect the fraud immediately? You know, given the rate of mixing in the Bitcoin economy, if we found out even a few days after an invalid block was created, I mean, what do we do? Do we just roll back? Do we just potentially invalidate millions of dollars worth of Bitcoins? I don't really have a good answer to that. And I suspect the answer in reality, if you deployed such a system, would be, we're just going to accept it, and someone's going to get away with fraud, and that's that. You know, and that potentially can destabilize an economy if people can create money out of thin air. You know, if people can go and seize other people's money. You know, we don't really have a clear idea of what that'll lead to.
Okay, thank you. One last comment. Anyone from the Chinese mining community have any questions or comments? 中国的矿工有没有对 Peter 有没有什么问题？刚刚他的
Okay, make English better. So there are two ways for mining. One way, you get money from the venture capital, make chips, make a mining equipment, then mining like 21, like a Bit4e. The second way is China way. China way, the way crowdfunding, like BTCC, like BW, like and Pool. They are raising money from the all community, like each other. They're raising Bitcoin. Then they're using Bitcoin to make chips, to make equipment, then mining, right? There are two different ways. We use the Chinese way is not like the Chinese way more friendly to the Bitcoin community, not like you know every people want to make a lot of the hashing power, then destroy this system. Everyone want to protect this system. Every Chinese mining pool together want the safety and protect this system. So they want to come here to know, do you have a suggestion? You know, you need your suggestion is, your solution way is wait after a couple years, then we do something, scaling thing. But we want more better way. For example, with more communication, with more, what a better idea is, do you have some better idea? Don't wait. 我的问题是，有什么更好的办法？不要等。
Are there better ways, better ideas, solutions that doesn't involve waiting?
Well, so, you know, an interesting, I mean, I was in China last week, and an interesting story I heard about was how there's been multiple occasions when Chinese mining operations have gone and loaned hashing power to other operations that, you know, say temporarily had a power cut or something, essentially as just good neighbors, you know, not necessarily getting any money even in return for loaning, you know, a lot of dollars worth of equipment. And, you know, I'd say as a developer, that's certainly something that lets me sleep well at night, knowing that I've got this extra layer between me and the harsh reality of crypto, in that, you know, we have a big community of people who behave a lot more altruistically than I think our assumptions built into the system are. But like Andrew was saying, we cannot rely on these kind of assumptions. You know, we need to design a system that still works in the face of adversary. You know, if we're in a situation where that very friendly, very helpful, very good mining community doesn't exist for some reason, I mean, who knows why? Maybe it's because some Western chip company finds a way of making chips 10 times faster. You know, maybe it's because the government of China has now restricted internet in a way that we can't usefully use. I still want to design a system that's resilient. And to answer your question directly, you know, currently, to the best of my knowledge, I don't really have a good way of getting the scale we want immediately without taking risks that I don't think are acceptable. I wish I could give a better answer than that, but I think you know, my caution is pretty much predicated on how I think we can very rapidly deploy systems such as Lightning, such as Payment Channel. I mean, even simpler solutions like ChangeTip, you know, in situations where they work in a way that's less risky to the whole ecosystem. And, you know, I think we're better off if we take that cautious approach, given how many billions of dollars we're dealing with here, you know. I wish I could go forge ahead faster, but I don't think the startup mentality necessarily works here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Jonathan Beer. Please come up to the stage. Jonathan will talk about why miners will not voluntarily and individually produce smaller blocks.
Hi, yeah, so I'm going to talk about block size economics. And a lot of this is kind of economic theory, so I don't know if this is all completely right. A lot of it's just kind of speculation and maybe a bit contentious. So I'm just going to, like the basics of kind of supply and demand for block space. So on the x-axis you've got transaction volume, and then on the y-axis you've got the transaction fee or the price. So that's just kind of the basics of what normal economic supply and demand looks like. And in order for this kind of theory to work, you need a marginal cost to kind of generate the supply curve. And there's a lot of contention over what the marginal cost is. So what it basically means is the additional cost to a miner of including one more transaction in their block. And this cost is actually probably very, very low. It's only propagation risk and maybe a tiny amount of data processing. So I think that there's a kind of fundamental or potential economic problem here, which is the marginal cost is very, very low, whilst the cost of hashing actually needs to be high for security reasons. So in about 2011, people started discussing the idea we need an artificial cap or a block size limit or an economically relevant block size limit to artificially kind of prop up the fee market. And this has always been quite contentious. And then recently someone's proposed that that orphan risk is actually enough in itself, so we don't need a fee market. So orphan risks, they are kind of a marginal cost. The larger the block, the higher the chance of orphan. Now I've got some issues of why orphan risk idea might not be that great. The first is that technology improves, and over time the technological cost of orphaning could get exponentially lower and lower. So you're relying on driving mining revenue or driving the fees with something that could become less relevant. And I also think that orphans, just by nature, are kind of bad, and that the aim of the system is to prevent orphans. And another reason is that orphan risks, in general, the larger you are, the larger your mining operation, because you don't need to propagate to yourself, then this basically incentivizes mining centralization, because a smaller miner will have to propagate to the rest of the network. A larger miner only needs to propagate to a smaller proportion of the network. And the defense that people give to this is they say that orphan risk isn't really a great concern. It doesn't matter if it goes up, and that it's just another cost to miners because there's rent, electricity, salaries, and the Chinese already have a competitive advantage in all these other factors. So all we're doing is adding one more cost, which, if anything, just increases decentralization because the Chinese already have an advantage in these other costs. But orphan risk is quite unique. Firstly, with these other costs, the economies of scale could run out. So if you've got very low energy costs because you're near a hydro plant or something, you're eventually going to use up the whole capacity. When the centralization risk from being a larger miner related to orphan risk is an inherent property of the system. So it might always encourage centralization. So at least with these other costs, we can hope that the impact eventually runs out, but with orphan risk it might not. So, and then there's the question of how does marginal orphan risk vary when the block size varies? So as the block size increases, is the marginal orphan risk linear, or does it exponentially go higher and higher? And basically I argue that whatever happens, you're always going to be in quite a bad scenario. So this is a kind of illustrative example where the dark green line is the marginal orphan risk cost, and then the yellow line that below it increasing is the average orphan risk cost. So you can see, and then you've got the kind of, the other two lines are the fees or the kind of demand curve. So this assumes that miners keep producing blocks up to the point where marginal orphan risk equals the marginal transaction fee. And then you can see the red area is the total orphan risk, and then the yellow area is the total average fees. So even in this kind of exponential scenario, you can see that that red area is a large proportion of the total revenue. So I think a key factor to look at is what is total marginal risk, total orphan risk relative to mining fee revenue. And if I was to draw this line where there was a linear relationship between block size and marginal orphan rate, then it would basically say almost 100% of mining revenue would actually be equal to the economic value of orphan risk cost. So I think that this is quite a potentially dangerous to kind of rely on orphan risk to drive the fee market. And then a very common question that people often ask is, well, why don't miners produce smaller blocks on their own? And why does a fee limit matter anyway? Miners will just produce smaller blocks. And again, this kind of theory was discussed a lot in 2011, and it's that each individual miner wants to generate as much like cash as possible in the short term. So they want to include as much transactions as possible. So there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One is look at the whole mining industry as a whole. And then maybe it makes sense. Maybe the mining industry will want to produce smaller blocks to kind of protect Bitcoin. But it's actually made up of a lot of individual miners. And the incentives for each individual miner is they want to produce larger blocks. They want to generate as much cash and earn as much fees as possible. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily agree with this. They say this is kind of too theoretical. It's unproven game theory. It focuses too much on next block and not like the longer term. Now, I think that this kind of tragedy of the commons problem, we can actually see that today in resources and commodity markets. So if you look at iron ore, for example, the miners keep producing more and more, and the price of iron ore keeps on falling. So although it is it's in the benefit of the iron ore industry as a whole for miners to cut production and allow the price to rise, but the game theory doesn't work like that. They each produce as much as possible to generate as much cash for themselves. And the same happens in oil and gold. And these miners never end up voluntarily reducing production a bit. What they end up doing is they just keep producing as much as they can to keep producing cash flow in order to ensure that they survive. And this is probably fine in most commodity markets, but for Bitcoin, we always need a healthy mining industry because it's always necessary for security. So but nobody is really right in this game theory. The reason it's quite contentious is because there's a kind of spectrum of how miners think. One group of people say that miners care about the long-term interests of the system and they're playing the game of life. And then at the other end of the spectrum is kind of miners care more about the short term, more about short-term profit maximization. And the reality is no one's right here. There's a whole spectrum. Different miners have different priorities. And what I think will happen is over the economic cycle, this could just kind of naturally vary. So, for example, if the Bitcoin price is crashing, if electricity costs are going up, miners' profit margins are going down, then they'll kind of move towards the next block game theory end of the spectrum. And we need to ensure that this system is robust in all scenarios and can survive across the economic cycle. So I think this kind of ties into what the previous speaker was saying. So when they were talking about the 30% selfish mining attack from China, that only really applies if miners have the short-term game theory idea. If they care more about the long-term interests of the system, then maybe they won't do that. So I think that we need to be aware of the economic cycles and how mining incentives will change and try to build a robust, resilient system across economic cycles. So some people look at the system as it is now, and the reality is everyone is collaborating, everyone does care about the long term. But there's a risk that could change in the future. And because of that risk, we need to kind of keep in mind everyone could all be very selfish and just care about the next block. So now I'm going to talk a bit about BIP100 and why it might solve some of these issues. So under BIP100, miners, of course, vote for the block size that they want. And rational miners should vote to maximize their revenue Some will care about more long-term revenue, some more about the short term. And what revenue is the block reward times the exchange rate plus the transaction volume times the average fee times the exchange rate. So this will mean that miners are voting in quite a balanced way. So at the moment, people in the community are kind of debating the relative importance of the fee level or the transaction volume level or the exchange rate. But BIP 100 will mean miners kind of dynamically vote in a balanced way, reflecting these competing priorities and trying to maximize the product of these things. And they'll make their decision based on what they think about the expected elasticity of demand for transactions. So this is a kind of illustrative example of how it could work. So now the supply curve is now just a straight line, and miners will just vote to shift that to the right or left, depending on the level of demand. And what they're trying to do is like maximize the area under the graph or maximize their fee revenue. And again, this is quite contentious because a lot of people don't like this kind of straight vertical line supply curve, because it implies that that blocks are always full, whereas other people have a vision where there's always excess capacity. And I don't think we should kind of make a decision now over whether we want always full blocks or whether we want excess capacity. What we need to do, I think, is just keep our options open. So don't adopt a scaling proposal that locks us into like constantly increasing block sizes such that we never have these full blocks. So I don't think we've got enough information now to have a right or wrong answer. Instead, we should just try and keep an open mind, have a moderate increase, or adopt this voting proposal that allows us to go in either direction in the future. A common criticism people have is that BIP 100 is a cartel. And I admit it does have some characteristics similar to how cartels operate. So it enables cartel-like pricing whilst avoiding the difficulties of an actual mining cartel. It's kind of like an open framework that allows miners to decide on the block size limit in a transparent way, which I think it's a good idea, because if we don't do this, there's a high risk that miners will form a cartel anyway in order to kind of restrict supply of space in blocks and drive up prices. So creating this BIP 100 transparent structure could actually act as a way of preventing an actual cartel from forming. And another proposal I have is, I think we need to recognize the difference between an increase in the limit and a decrease. So an increase in the limit actually requires approval from all full nodes if it's a hard fork, in order to accept the larger blocks. Whereas actually a majority of miners can impose a decrease in the limit anyway without the need for a hard fork, any change, because 55% of miners or whatever can always reject any block larger than amount. So they can form this cartel anyway. And this is why I think that these voting mechanisms should always reflect this power balance. So I think there's a proposal that it requires 80% in order to decrease the limit, whereas I think it should always be 50%, because say 79% vote for a limit reduction and then no limit occurs because it requires the 80%. This is kind of like advertising that 79% of miners want the limit down, and I think this will serve as the catalyst for the formation of a cartel anyway. If 79% of miners have the power to reduce the limit, they could just ignore the voting procedure, so there's a risk that the voting could be undermined. So I think that any of these voting processes should always have that bear in mind how the actuality works and allow 50% of miners to kind of insert their will and reduce the limit if they want. At the same time, I'm not claiming that BIP 100 is perfect. There's a lot of problems. People have pointed out that the block size limit will be suboptimal and will maximize the utility for miners and not users. But I mean, it's very difficult to say because utility for users is kind of very subjective anyway. And then I think I like BIP 100 from a kind of economics perspective. So there's a lot of like much better technical experts than me that will have other objections of, we can't increase the limits so much. So I'm in favor of kind of upper and lower bounds. And I think there are no perfect solutions, and I think we need to be kind of pragmatic and work together and be willing to compromise and accept something that we don't like, because there's a lot of pressure and some people are very keen to move in a particular direction. So I think there's a lot of good proposals out there that seem okay, and I think it's important that we agree on something. Otherwise, there's going to be a criticism that nothing's going to happen. Thank you very much, and if you've got any questions.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So I had another idea that I wanted to hear your take on. So rather than creating this consensus mechanism where you have the block size changing as a way of miners determining what the supply for block space should be, why not use miner policy, a non-hard fork, non-fork related aspect to control the minimum price available? So basically creating a fee floor for inclusion of a transaction into a block. Have you thought about that before? What do you think about that? And the idea is basically that you'd be using altruistic punishment in order to enforce the fee floor. Miners could set a certain percentage of their hash power as a way of intentionally orphaning people or miners who try to break that minimum floor. I'm not sure that I like this idea. I just wanted to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I've thought about it a bit, and I think it's an interesting idea, but I think this has, people already don't like Bit 100 because it's kind of like putting the miners in control and manipulating the market to some extent. Having a fee floor kind of manipulates the market even more and is likely to make people even less happy. And I think that effectively is a mining cartel, and we want to kind of avoid that cartel as much as possible.
I just wanted to add one word or one term: collective bargaining. That's all.
We have another question in the back.
I've noticed that some miners have credibly said that the 1 megabyte limit is already straining the network quite significantly. What do you think is the prudent approach is that we're talking about scaling the network larger than 1 megabyte? However, other proposals have suggested that it might be prudent to go and take a bit of a wait and see approach. Do you think that the comments from the miners that 1 megabyte is already difficult enough should be taken seriously?
Yeah, I think it should be taken seriously. So I think we shouldn't rush to have a big jump up in the block size now. And I think we need a moderate, prudent approach and balance that considers everyone's opinions. But I think there's a risk that if we don't do anything now, then the community could kind of split into two, with some people very, very keen to have an aggressive schedule. So to kind of react to that, we need to, if we have some kind of moderate proposal now, it will make the position of the other side of the argument more difficult to kind of break away. I think remaining together in one group is really important.
We have another question in the back.
Sorry for me. And I'm Hugo again. And can I ask you a question? Because I noticed about you can design the limits of the transaction, and if they are high, what is the biggest limit for you? And if they decide to vote for the bigger limits, will that be affordable to the bundle holders? And with these limits, will that be really good to the miners to gain the profit? And because of the Bitcoin reward halving, and what is the advantage to prevent the transaction spamming, like stress test, is regarding what is the BIP 100 or so on?
Yeah, I think maybe you're asking about the spamming, and that people were filling up the blocks by just creating spam transactions, and why were miners including this spam? And I think it goes back to before. It's kind of the game theory is that miners just want to eventually, once there's enough fees, they'll want to include as much transactions as possible. So eventually all blocks will be full, whatever reason people are using it for, whether it's for spam, data storage. So that's why a lot of people have this vision that all blocks are full, rather than having these kind of excess capacity and not having all blocks full.
A question here.
Yeah, just a quick comment / question. Do you think that there would be value in the equation that you showed in calculating the value of the block to basically add a multiplier around that whole thing that is kind of the percentage likelihood of increase that you have in getting the next block as a factor of block size? Right, because theoretically, as the size increases, again, as we get these, these concentrations of mining, you get an advantage by the block being bigger and delaying propagation to other people. Do you think that's a factor worth building in here, or do you think it's just too small to worry about, or?
Yeah, I don't know, because of course that is an advantage, but at the same time it's a disadvantage because there's a higher probability of orphan. So that, at the moment, that higher probability of orphan is probably much greater than the theoretical selfish mining attack that you'd have more chance of finding the next one. So that of course depends on each individual miner's hash rate. If you own 35%, then sure, you've probably got an advantage of creating a bigger block. If you own 1% or less, then you've got an advantage in creating a smaller block because you don't want to be orphaned. So that element of the calculation, I think, depends on each individual miner's circumstance.
Okay, the last question in the back.
I just saw that you said BIP 100, BIP 102 and 103 are somewhat reasonable proposals, right? What is your stand on BIP 105 and 106?
Sorry, I don't know those.
Those are in BIP proposals on GitHub.
Okay, well, we got to go to break and think about those proposals. All right, we have a 15-minute break. Come back at 12:15. Thank you very much. Coffee is on the right side. Face the stage to your right. Thank you, Jonathan.
attribution like Russell. Like, I think I just broke my own rule. Boom, boom, boom.
That's it. It's good to set these counterexamples because it makes everyone else feel
No, I was
comfortable. Yeah. No, no. So I mean, but okay, there are some of us in this space for whom who are on that side where I'm happy for my comments to be repeated explicitly. I mean, all my stuff is open out in the open, and I'm very comfortable with that, and I don't have any sensitivities like commercial confidential stuff. It's just not even on my radar. So I am kind of in a fairly lucky position. But it's important that we keep that awareness because there's certainly a lot of people here who, and also it sets the standard for other people who maybe didn't come because they were nervous about things like that. If we make it very clear, it makes it easier in the future. We say no, there will be this rule if people will be respected.
And this was respect. We're trying to be consistent.
Yeah.
So we set the rules straight. So
Yeah, that totally works. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting.
Are you a tag team? I know.
Yeah, we're tagging. Yeah. I didn't
Welcome back. Please have a seat. We'll get started in 2 minutes.
Thank you. No worries.
Yeah, I think so. And that one is coming, I guess.
Yeah, they'll flip it
Yeah.
from down there. I think we'll get that as well.
Yes.
Yeah. How do you spell it? How do you pronounce it?
Kalle.
Kalle.
Oh, great.
Kalle. Yeah.
Rusty Russell. Yeah. Kalle.
Well, it's actually my nick.
Oh, okay.
It's actually Carl. But,
Right,
I
but
think it sounds pretty dorky, so I
It's good to have a unique first name because then it simplifies mapping. Absolutely. Having a unique first name is good.
Yeah, instead of Carl, if you Google Carl Rosenbaum, you'll get heaps.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, they stole a second from us.
No, I think they added one. I think we get a bonus. Or maybe that's...
No, that...
Right, 23.
That's
good.
Sound check, 1 2 1 2. Sound check. Sound check, 1 2 1 2.
We could have done that. So what we'll do is we'll switch positions because that's the mic.
Yes. Yeah.
I will just stand here looking pretty or something.
Yeah.
So you talk and we can switch.
Do what you're doing best.
That's weird. I can translate into sign for you.
Yeah.
So I don't know sign language, so it would be completely made up.
Okay, let's get started. Grab a seat.
We're not timing.
Okay, before we get started, I want to remind the audience about the code of conduct, photography rules. The guideline is for privacy reasons and for no attribution reasons. Please do not take any pictures of any of the attendees. Many attendees want to remain private individuals, so do not have any of them in your photographs. I believe it's okay to take pictures of the speakers, of the stage, and I think the slides are also okay given that we're simulcasting and broadcasting it, okay? So no photographs of any attendees. Let them remain anonymous and private. Okay, and for Chinese speakers, please ask your questions in Chinese, and I'll use American English to translate. 中国的人，你们想问问题，请用中文来问来表达，我会帮你们翻译翻成英文，好不好？谢谢配合。Okay, thank you. So our next speaker, we have two speakers, Calais Rosenbaum and Rusty Russell. Please welcome. They will speak about IBLT and the weak block propagation performance. Please enjoy.
Can we get the slides up there? So? Great, thank you. So I'm Kalle, and this is obviously Rusty. We will talk about block propagation and how it can be improved by using IBLT and weak blocks. I will start by talking about invertible Bloom lookup tables, IBLT. And first, credit goes to Gavin Andreessen for putting this idea out there. And we also acknowledge the work of Michael Goodrich and Michael Mitzenmacher for their 2011 paper on IBLT. IBLT allows for efficient set reconciliation if sets are similar. And that can work great for Bitcoin blocks if mempools don't differ too much. I will briefly describe how IBLT works. You have this block that you want to propagate to a peer, and you take each of these transactions and you chop them up into slices of fixed size. And then you run each slice through a number of hash functions, and those hash functions will give you an index where to add the slice. Adding a slice will bitwise XOR it into the IBLT, so the IBLT will not grow when you add data to it. And when you're finished, you will take this IBLT and send it off to the peer. The peer will receive it and make a guess on what transactions you have put in there. So he will take each transaction in his guess and remove them in the same way that I added them, by slicing them up and hashing them to get the index and then remove from those cells. And then what's left when he's finished is the difference between the block and the recipient's guess. And now if this IBLT is sparse enough, those differences can be extracted and the transactions reassembled from there. So we'll do some simulations, and for those we need to nail some parameters. The first one is the number of hash functions to use. and the second one is the value size or the slice size. In my previous slide, I had 3 hash functions and 64-byte values, slices. I will show you where those come from. To find a good value for, or a good number of hash functions, we searched for the smallest possible IBLT that would successfully decode 100 transactions. And it turns out that there is no point in having more than 3 hash functions. And then we did the same for value size. It's not very sensitive, but we picked 64-byte values since it seems at least marginally best. Now, we want to see what happens when IBLT is used in a real-world scenario. So we used Rusty's Bitcoin Corpus project that covers 721 blocks from 4 different nodes. The average block size in this set is 380K. And we will only focus on the Australian node in this set right now. So we ask, how small can we make this IBLT in order to successfully transmit 95% of the blocks to Australia? You have on the x-axis here, you have the failure probability, and on the y-axis, you have the IBLT size. So with an IBLT of 21 kilobytes, that's 5.7% of the average block size. You will successfully transmit 95% of the blocks. And further, if we use an IBLT of 10 kilobytes, that's 2.6% of the average block size. We can successfully transmit 94% of the blocks to Australia. This is, of course, based. This is a stupid solution where we use a fixed-sized IBLT across all block transfers. Rusty will tell you more later about dynamic IBLT sizing and further improve on that. So now we want to see what happens when the number of differences grow. To do that, we will select a number of differences randomly from the blockchain, and we will also select an IBLT size, and then we will encode and decode those transactions and see if it fails or succeeds. And then we repeat this a ridiculous amount of times to measure failure probability. This is one way of visualizing the result. The lines here represent from top to bottom 32 differences, 64 differences, and so on down to 1024 differences. And for us, on the x-axis you have the failure probability, and on the y-axis you have the diff cost. That's the IBLT size divided by the number of diffs. So the first thing we can notice here is that for a certain failure probability, the diff cost will decrease as the number of differences increase. And also, the other thing we can note is that there's a sweet spot right below the knee of each of these lines. That means that we can decrease failure probability very cheaply down to that specific sweet spot. Also, that sweet spot will move towards 0 as the number of differences increase. For example, the sweet spot is at 1.5% for 32 differences, while the sweet spot is at 0.1% failure probability for 1024 differences. Okay, I will illustrate this with an example. We have to make a few assumptions in this example. We will assume here that the number of differences increase linearly with transaction rate. And we will also assume that the block size increase linearly with transaction rate. The corpus averages about 6 diffs per block. And now let's pretend that the transaction rate increases by a factor of 10, 100, and 1,000. That would mean that we would have to encode 6 differences for factor 1, 60 differences, 600 differences, and 6,000 differences. What would that look like now if we target 5% failure probability? As we saw in the earlier graph, the diff cost will decrease as the number of differences increase, and that's what we see here as well. You have the factor 1 on your left and the factor 1,000 on your right. An IBLT encoding a typical block today would take about 2.2% of the block size. But that percentage will improve as the number of differences grow, or for each tenfold. We will end up with less than 1% of the block size if the transaction rate would thousandfold. This is, of course, based on the assumption of linearity between transaction rate and differences. So far, we have tested the fixed size IBLT on the Bitcoin Corpus project and seen that 21K is enough to transmit 95% of the blocks. And we've also seen that IBLT has some really nice scaling properties. And I will hand over to Rusty now, who will take the rest. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to dig down a bit, and I'm going to talk about the proposed Bitcoin IBLT protocol that we have. So, I like pictures. Here's a picture. That's our block with all our transactions in it. And there's node 1 mempool. The node 1, this is the node receiving the block. Its mempool looks very similar to the block. You can see there are 2 transactions, the red ones, that are in the block, but it doesn't know about. And there's transactions it knows about that are not in the block. So effectively, in our algorithm, what we do is we basically take the things that we didn't know about, throw them into our mempool, and we remember how much that was, in this case, 2 transactions. Okay, so our result with that included is our node 1 mempool kind of looks like this. We pick a point in this. We order this by fee rate. Okay, and we assume, hey, you basically have to have paid about this much per kilobyte in order to get into the block. Except for these ones, we have a set of things that we would have expected to get in the block that didn't, and similarly, we have a set of transactions that got into the block despite being below our fee hint. Now, if we want to send this to node 2, we take that hint information that we've assembled and send it through. And as you could see, if I flick that, basically node 2 uses that information to trim its candidate set, basically trim its mempool. This refinement turns out to be particularly important. And that hint is encoded quite densely, so that's pretty cheap. Then, of course, we send through the IBLT, and it does the subtraction and hopefully recovers the 3 transactions it didn't know about and discovers the 1 extra one that it had put in that didn't belong in the block. Okay, now one thing I skipped over here was sizing. Here I said that the node 1 guesses the size of the IBLT to be about 24 buckets. How does it figure that out? It turns out that mempools, at least across the corpus, were pretty similar. In fact, the big difference was in the block that was received. A whole heap of block was full of stuff that we'd never seen before. So what we do is we go, okay, let's assume that the block is about as similar to the recipient's mempool as it is to our mempool, and then add some extra factors to cover the fact that it might be slightly different. Okay, so we have 2 ways to do extra factors. One is a fixed amount. Let's assume, say, that they have, they're going to have 2 transactions that they won't have that we had. And the other one is just to have a multiplier. So if you have, this on the z-axis is the number of transactions that you assume that they don't have, and on the x-axis is basically the extra factor that you choose. And of course, it's a linear relationship that you bump these factors up, your IBLT gets bigger. But your recovery probability is not linear. So You squint at these numbers for a bit and you play around, and the answer is you basically add 10 slices to the number that you would have needed to reconstruct the block, and you multiply the whole result by 1.35. And that, across our 826 megabyte transmission across the corpus, gives us a result of about 20 megabytes transmitted for 95% reconstruction, or about 2.4% of the original transmission size. So, in this model, we have we use a very, very simple assumption across the corpus. The first node of these 4 nodes in the corpus to receive the block, we pretend that transmits an IBLT to all the others to tell the other nodes about it. So that gives us our 826 megabytes. In this case, we've cut it down to 20. Now, 4% of these blocks are actually sent raw. It was basically, we figured out how big the IBLT was going to be, and it was going to be bigger than the block itself, so we just assume we send the block unencoded. Now I'm going to switch gears. Awesome. Weak blocks. So this is an idea that was previously called near blocks. Peter Todd talked about it, like most things, years before I'd heard of it. So I called them weak blocks because I didn't know about his work. And the idea of weak blocks is completely different, so forget everything you've heard about IBLT. Basically, miners send blocks that didn't quite make the threshold. These are cool because they're naturally rate limited, because they take a lot of work to produce. They offer some kind of provable insight into what the miners are actually mining. And importantly for our discussion, all blocks can be simply encoded in terms of previous weak blocks, because they'll kind of be similar. So when we're talking about propagation, that's what we're talking about. So here's a weak block number 1, a weak block number 2. We're ignoring the Coinbase. And you can see it's basically the same thing with some more transactions tacked in, right? Assume a simple 2-byte encoding. This is the dumbest thing you could possibly do, which is basically you say, okay, this weak block is, the previous weak blocks, transaction number 18, number 1, number 3, et cetera, and then, you tack the ones that it didn't include before on the end. So we assume basically a 2-byte overhead per transaction. So we take our corpus, because I love the corpus, and we randomly generate a weak block. We assume one of the peers generates a weak block on average every 30 seconds, and transmit that instantly to the other nodes. So then when we hit a real block, we just encode that against the last weak block that everyone knows about. Okay, so remember our raw blocks gave us 826 megabytes. If we assume we generate a weak block on average every 30 seconds, we end up only transmitting about 35 megabytes to represent the strong blocks. So in order to send a strong block, we've only had to transmit that small percentage of data. The total amount of data, however, almost doubles, because now we're sending all the weak blocks as well. Okay. Now, whether that matters or not depends on your perspective. Yes, you're using more bandwidth, but you're not using it at the critical point, which is that latency of transmitting your strong blocks. So which of those numbers you care about is relative. So it's a good result and a bad result. Now, we can actually do a little bit better than this by introducing super weak blocks. So it turns out, and there's a really good point in the corpus where we get a row of full blocks, right? This corpus is from months ago, like almost 12 months ago now. And we were seeing full blocks back then. And we caught some in the corpus, which is really nice. And when blocks are full, and in a world where blocks are always full, this will always be true, you want that first weak block as soon as possible. Because if you get a strong block before you hit a weak block, you can't use weak block encoding. So wouldn't it be nice if the first weak block was, you allow that to be 16 times weaker than a normal weak block, which means instead of average every 30 seconds, you get one average every 2 seconds. Hand wave of what first is in this system. But that cuts down from 35 to 27 megabytes. And our total only increases a little bit. So there is some benefit in doing that, and certainly a huge benefit when we're looking at full blocks, because that primes the pump for those full blocks and gives extra savings. So now, there are real limitations, and I really just like the way I simulated this on the weak block corpus. In the corpus, because I'm pretending that the peers that we're talking about are actually generating the weak blocks, now those peers are all very, very similar. In practice in the corpus, the actual blocks are more different than the mempools of the peers, so we would expect worse compression than this in practice. Okay. But with that aside, now everybody likes ice cream, everyone likes ketchup, so let's put them together. IBLT and weak blocks. Remember, we had 826 megabytes when we sent the raw, and that's just spraying out to all 3 of them. We got 95% recovery in 20 megabytes with IBLT. We got down to 27 megabytes, or 1.5 gig, depending on how you measure it, for weak blocks. If we do both, we drop the cost of sending the strong blocks, the critical ones, down to 15 megabytes, and we actually bump up the accuracy to 98% reconstruction. And we drop the 1.5 gigs sent down to 233 megabytes overall, but we get a horrifically bad reconstruction rate for the weak blocks. We can tune the IBLT dynamic estimator to get that 95% number back, but the reason I hate this result is that this is actually an artifact of the way we simulated the blocks. It's not real. The weak blocks propagate instantly in my model, so they overtake the transactions that are within them. So in that case, you know, your IBLT hurts pretty badly because it's got a whole heap of transactions that haven't been seen yet. So order of magnitude, yeah, there's definitely some wins in here, but take those numbers with a huge grain of salt. Okay, so let's assume what would this look like when we actually deploy it. So we have a new, basically, block transmission message, and this allows us to do either IBLT or weak blocks, which is pretty straightforward. We just linearize it all. Of course, you've got a problem with deployment of weak blocks. If you go, we're going to produce one every 30 seconds, you set the threshold to a 20th of the normal setting difficulty, and until anyone deploys it, you won't see any weak blocks in the network at all. So we can ratchet it up from an incredibly low difficulty and work our way up. That's fairly simple. And there are a whole heap of other interesting things that we can do. And I put them on this slide because I knew I would run out of time about now. So we have we can do much better with our, if we do canonical ordering. And in fact, blocks are now coming out very close to canonical order with version 4 blocks. We can do some Coinbase encoding, where we actually send the Coinbase in weak blocks and we encode against previous Coinbases, because average Coinbase is about 580 bytes. That's the mean. So we can save some extra things there. And if blocks are really, really small, we can send them out unsolicited and drop the latency of the network significantly that way. And finally, I wanted to mention we can use IBLT to synchronize mempools as well. Okay.
Thank you. So we'll take questions. Question here.
Can you talk a little bit about adversarial conditions where a miner may decide not to send transactions in IBLT for the purpose of slowing down other...
Okay, yes. So our IBLT model does not assume miner cooperation at all, because the IBLT is generated between peers. So the miner can send out a full block, but then we IBLT it. Of course, they can generate something that sucks to IBLT, right? They can put stuff in the pool, in the, you know, if we've never seen it in the mempool before, IBLT doesn't help you at all. So they can still make a block that is terrible to propagate, just as they can make a block today which is terrible to validate. So I think, you know, we obviously can improve the best case, but the worst case, the adversarial case, there's not much we can do about. You will fall back to sending plain blocks about. In a world where miners are living off fees, that may have a cost for them to fill a block full of crap. But at the moment, we actually do see it on the network. And it's in the corpus. We see blocks that we've got nothing in common with our mempool, and we just have to send them raw.
We have another question over here.
Can you say anything about encoding latency in terms of milliseconds and how the network latency affects it? Can you give some rough numbers for what that would take? So
encoding is fast. Is that rough enough for you? IBLT encoding is actually pretty damn fast. There's a lot of XORing. There's some hashing. One of the overheads is that you really can't use the transaction ID for hashing. At least you can't use it straight, because if you get IBLT clashes, you can make an IBLT that can't decode. Now you can detect that and you can send that transaction in the raw if you want to, but by definition, a miner who's trying to minimize the size of their things they're sending out is going to start dropping transactions that conflict with other ones. So you could then do a DOS if you could create those conflicts. So the cleanest way to do that is to basically have a secret and rehash everything. Rehash the transaction IDs to produce 48-bit IBLT IDs. And that has some cost to it. But it's pretty damn cheap. Like, it's cheap enough that the model where you customize it for each peer makes a lot of sense.
And follow up, how many round trips is it? Is it just one or is it two?
Just one. You send the IBLT, and if they reconstruct it, you're done. Obviously, if they have to go, oh crap, and fetch a manual block, then yeah, you've got a second round trip.
We have another question back here.
during your testing, have you tried to see what happens when different nodes have different policy on mempool? Because in the wild, not everybody has the same mempool, right?
Yeah. So we didn't. It's a very good question. So originally we were going to do a dynamic sizing based on your previous interactions with the peer. You could guess how close their mempool's been historically, and you go, okay, so we're obviously a bit out of sync, so I'm going to bump up the IBLT size. We can still do that. We didn't have to do that for this. But that will also allow us to optimize even more, and I think reduce our IBLT size even further, in the case where we do happen to be in sync with other peers. But we will, in real deployments, we would have to take that into account as mempools diverge because of policy reasons.
Any other questions?
Okay, question over here.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the weak blocks would be published by the miners?
Yeah, miners would pushing out the weak
Can you
blocks.
talk about like the cost versus the incentives of miners to be publishing them? And like what would change with the sort of game theory if, say, we were experiencing a slew of full blocks with huge mempool backlogs?
Yeah, so if you publish your own weak blocks, then you speed up your transmissions of strong blocks if you find one. You potentially speed up other people's as well, but if most people are doing it, the gain is net to you. If nobody's doing it, then the first person to do it does kind of pay. So having this ratchet scheme makes sense. So you can have even tiny miners start producing them. The particular, I referenced the fact that we could do Coinbase diffs, because your own Coinbase tends to be unique. So generally for weak blocks, it's a wash. But your binary diff of your Coinbase and your weak block versus your Coinbase if you get a strong block is probably pretty damn small. So maybe we should do a diff encoding to kind of encourage you to publish your weak blocks, because you could save another half a K on big blocks. And when we talk about really getting aggressive with mining optimizations, maybe that half a K is worth something to you.
Okay, one last question here.
So yeah, regarding different policies, and I already talked with you about this, can we have just one mempool with everything you've seen for everyone and just your own mempool for what you want to mine?
Yes, absolutely. So I talk about a mempool here as if it's the current mempool, but really the mempool could just be anything you think somebody might have, including conflicting transactions. You can throw those in. In fact, you can have things in your mempool that you would never include in a block yourself. That you'll still do the same trimming step, and it works pretty damn well in practice. So you can certainly, even if you're not interested in everything, you can certainly have basically an extra mempool of extra stuff very cheaply.
Okay, thank you very much. Great speaking. Thank you, Kale, and thank you, Russ. Next speaker is Arthur Gervais. We'll be speaking about tampering with the delivery of blocks and transactions in Bitcoin.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, hello everybody. So this is work I've done with my co-workers at NEC Research and ETH Zurich, tampering with the delivery of blocks and transactions in Bitcoin. So as everybody knows, I guess here as everybody is very familiar with Bitcoin, I mean, we are talking about a peer-to-peer decentralized currency, and we don't have any banks. The blockchain is a distributed ledger where we gather transactions periodically in blocks. And a particularly important layer that I'm addressing today in this talk is actually the broadcast protocol. So why is the broadcast protocol important? So if you look here at this figure on the left side, let's assume that this peer is actually creating a block or a transaction and propagating it in the network. So it goes one layer, it goes a second layer, and you notice at this point the rightmost node has only one link to the potentially adversarial node here. If this node is not forwarding a transaction or block, it effectively performs an eclipse attack, such that the node will not know anything about this particular transaction or block. And such an eclipse attack is bad because it creates the possibility of a denial of service in the most simple case, but there are more sophisticated implications, such as double spending or other things that I will present later. So eclipse attacks are framers. I mean, Hallman et al., for example, at Usenix this year, they have shown how they can be performed in practice in Bitcoin, in the real network. They, however, had a couple of assumptions. So, first of all, the adversary needs to monopolize the connections of the victim, such as in this figure here. It needs to spam with new addresses on the network layer to inform about new IP addresses. It requires the node to actually restart in order to connect to the adversary nodes. So, and therefore it requires also many IP addresses, so many bots that are required in order to attack this node. So in this talk, and in the associated paper to this talk, we actually present a technique that we can actually perform an Eclipse attack, such as this one, with only one TCP connection. And we don't do any prior assumptions about the connections of the victim. Furthermore, we don't need any victim restart. So this is actually a very realistic attack. So how do we do this? In order to explain it to you, I have to talk about the scalability measures that we have on the peer-to-peer network layer. So the first one is the transaction block advertisement. So how do we advertise a block in the network? So it's very important to note that we, before broadcasting the transaction itself, we actually advertise its hash. So it's just the simple hash of the transaction or the block. In the second step then, we have the transaction block request management system where given the hash, if I don't know about hash, I would just ask for the particular transaction or the block, and then I will get it from an honest peer. Currently, one of the scalability measures is that we actually request it only from one peer. And if this peer doesn't respond, well, we need a request timeout. So let's say here's an adversary, he advertises a transaction or block to a peer. Then obviously we want to receive this, but the adversary is not responding. In the meantime, there might be another peer advertising the same transaction or block, right? So at some point in time, we have to time out here, and we get the transaction or the block from the other peer. So these timeout settings in Bitcoin are currently set to static. So we have a 20-minute static block timeout and a 2-minute transaction timeout. Okay, so far these are the scalability measures that we're looking at. So how can we abuse these scalability measures? So in this talk, basically we are presenting a technique where we can blind a victim from blocks and transactions for longer than 20 minutes. And we have performed an experimental validation in the actual Bitcoin network. So this has been done and implemented. So we show the impact in this talk in particular regarding double spanning of transactions and a possible network-wide denial of service attack. And if you're curious, in our associated paper, you will find details about aggravated selfish mining. And more importantly, we proposed a couple of countermeasures that harden the network, because in order to avoid these types of attacks, and in the paper you can as well see an estimate of the waiting time for secure transactions. So the first requirement in order to perform this type of attack, this blinding technique, is that the adversary is the first peer that advertises a transaction or block, because the first peer is the one that we requested from. So once the network advertises a hash to the adversary should forward it as fast as possible to the victim, such that the victim says, okay, thank you, this is a new hash, I will wait for you to send me the actual transaction or block. So we have to be here we have to be faster than the network. The second requirement for the attack to work is that the victim should wait. As I mentioned earlier, we have 20 minutes timeouts for blocks, 2 minutes timeouts for transactions. So we validated the first requirement as being first by implementing a node in Zurich at ETH, and we had on the other side about 10 nodes distributed across the globe. And so simply the node in Zurich got the hash, advertised it to the other nodes that we attacked, so our own nodes in the network. And if we have been fast enough to relay this first, faster than the network, we counted this as a success. So our numbers, just to give you here a couple of numbers, are actually independent of the connections of the adversary and the connections of the victim. So these are actually connections to full nodes, so no SPV clients here, because they don't forward data, so it's irrelevant. What's interesting is actually that the more connections the adversary has in the network, well, the earlier he gets information. So we had about 90% probability of being first of relaying a hash. The second requirement is waiting. Okay, let's first tackle transactions because they're a bit easier. So for transactions, we currently have a FIFO queue. So if an adversary advertises a transaction hash multiple times, there will be a 2 minutes timeout each time. So in this case, a 6-minute timeout in total. And we're done. So this is basically, this is the technique for blinding a peer from a transaction. So for blocks, however, it's a bit more tricky. So after 20 minutes, what happens? Typically, we disconnect and we do nothing. There's however, a special case that if we receive a block header, the node disconnects and requests the blocks from another peer because the block header already indicates, oh, there's something out there, we should get it. So what is the requirement to delay a block for blocks for more than 20 minutes to a particular node? So the first requirement is that we must not receive a block header. Why is that? Well, as you may be familiar, in Bitcoin there is a header first synchronization. So we first get the header and later we get the block associated to the header. So and the header already indicates, oh, there is some block available, and therefore the client actually requests more aggressively the block. So we need to avoid the situation. The second requirement for this attack to work is that the victim should not receive a version message. So why is that? Because at connection initiation, both peers, they say, hey, I have block height 10, the other says, oh, I have block height 15, and then one node says, okay, it seems I'm a bit back, please send me the new headers such that I can sync with the latest blockchain. So in order to avoid this version message exchange, we can basically occupy all open connection slots of a node such that this node does not create any new connections. We don't make any assumptions about existing connections because there won't be any version message exchange. Okay, and the requirements for the adversary are as before, so still we need to be the first one that relays the hash, as we said before, and we should perform the connection depletion in order to delay blocks for longer than 20 minutes. So just to go a bit more into detail, this is actually a walkthrough of a particular example. So let's say we have an adversary and we have a victim here. At a given point in time, we find a block B. Okay, the adversary chooses to not attack. Both peers sync to the main, sync the header first, then sync the blockchain. So they're both at block B. After some time, there will be a new block, B+1, which is found. So now the adversary actually chooses to attack. He syncs with this to the current block B+1, but at the same time he advertises the hash of block B+1 to the victim, effectively triggering a 20 minutes timeout for this particular block. So the victim doesn't know anything about block B+1, stays at block B. After some time, there's another block B+2 which is found. Again, the adversary chooses to attack. Again, he chooses to advertise the hash, triggering another 20 minutes timeout for block B+2. So here the adversary, the victim actually won't learn about B+2, and he still is not aware of B+1, so he doesn't know anything. And you may note that at this point in time, the timeout for B+1 is expiring. But since we assume that the victim has not received any header, he won't do anything. He will not request a new block anywhere because he has no proof that there's any new block. So the adversary can just re-advertise the same hash, effectively re-triggering a new 20 minutes timeout. So and this is actually the point where we can extend the delay above 20 minutes. Let's say block B+3 is found, and the attacker, either he's unsuccessful or he decides to stop the attack, so he won't advertise any new hash to the victim. So the first timeout that actually expires here is B+2. And at this point, the victim will learn about B+3. But since he doesn't know about B+1 and B+2 actually in this case, so he still cannot sync to the main blockchain. So because the other timeouts are still pending. So the first timeout that expires here is B+2, and at some point in time, finally, the timeout for B+1 expires, and at this point in time, the victim is actually able to resync to the main chain. Okay, so it's kind of an interactive, basically, way of advertising hash and waiting and re-advertising the hash in order to re-trigger a timeout. So our expected success is the following. So on the x-axis, you can see the number of consecutively denied blocks to a particular victim. So we went up to 30 consecutive blocks. on the y-axis, you can see the probability of success. We base this expected results actually on p equal like about 80%, which is reasonable, and we've seen this is realistic in our setting. And our measured success, so what we actually measured in the network, is this one. So they're pretty much equivalent, right? So this means we can deny 5 consecutive blocks with about 40% probability. It's quite an amount of time. Okay, so what's the impact? I mean, why should we matter, right? The first and most important impact probably is double spending. So what is double spending? I guess most of you are familiar. Just a brief recap. We have a legitimate, we have a double spend transaction. The adversary is advertising 2 different conflicting transactions. Eventually the vendor is accepting the payment if he doesn't wait for block confirmation. He provides the goods and services, and then eventually the majority accepts the double spend transactions, and the victim basically won't be paid. Okay. So in this particular setting, given the delay of the block and the transactions, we can do the following attack. So we can blind the vendor from accepting a particular transaction. So let's say TX double spend. So we just advertise the hash, right? The vendor will, the adversary will then forward this double spend transaction in the Bitcoin network. And since the vendor is blinded for this particular transaction, the vendor won't request this particular transaction from the network, so he won't receive it. Now, the adversary can send a legitimate transaction to the vendor, but since the vendor will try now to broadcast this in the network, but since it's conflicting with the double spend transaction, well, the Bitcoin network will just reject it, right? So, and at this point in time, if the vendor accepts zero conf, well, the game is over. The only requirement here is that the adversary knows the IP address of the Bitcoin node of the vendor, which might be a strong requirement based on your setting. The second impact that we would like to point out is denial of service. So if you assume 6,000 reachable nodes, I mean, I know we lost some in the last weeks. If you want to prevent the delivery of blocks and transactions to those 6,000 nodes, I estimated that we need about 500,000 of TCP connections, which is not that much. And we only need about 600 kilobytes of advertisements per block every 20 minutes. For the 20-minute timeout. So this is not that much of a requirement for a network-wide denial of service attack against all public Bitcoin nodes. Okay, so what can we do about that? So why don't we make the smaller, the static timeout smaller? I mean, this would be maybe a small and easy fix. Well, we did some measurements here, and actually it turns out that we might cut off some lower nodes, some smaller bandwidth nodes by doing this. So this depends basically on what should be the requirement to run a full node. Okay, but why not request a transaction or block for multiple peers? Well, that's scalability, right? If you request a block or transaction for multiple peers, you will just need more bandwidth, there will be less bandwidth available, and so on. What about alternative relay networks? So there's Matt Corrales relay networks. Obviously, this is a great solution for miners if they want to receive blocks. And this is something I would say additional, which is great, but we still need somehow a reliable native peer-to-peer network in Bitcoin. So there's a security versus scalability trade-off that we need to take into account here. So what we propose are actually dynamic timeouts. So based on the object size, so on the size of the transaction, on the size of the block, the timeout should be not static, but dynamic. We can also measure the latency to a particular peer, maybe even the bandwidth to a particular peer. Second of all, we should handle the transaction advertisement differently. There shouldn't be a FIFO queue. So we should, first of all, filter by IP address. So one IP address, for example, can only advertise a transaction once. In addition, we should choose randomly some senders and not just in a FIFO setting, right? So we can, and if we don't receive a transaction, we can first request from 1, then from 2, and so on, to be sure to receive it at some point in time. Most importantly, we should update the block advertisement, and this is actually something which is now a milestone in 0.12, that the block propagation will be based on the hash, based on the block header instead of the hash only. So this is a big improvement, I think, that has just been made into 0.12, and this will mitigate the block attack that I just presented significantly. So to summarize, so we have shown that the scalability measures that are currently in place in the peer-to-peer network layer actually impact the security of Bitcoin. We have shown how to delay a transaction or block for at least 20 minutes, and one TCP connection for that is sufficient. And we have shown the impact of double spending. I refer you to the paper in order to read about aggravated selfish mining, and we talked briefly about service here. So we had a couple of proposals on how to harden the network, to be more resilient against these types of attacks. And in the paper, you can also see an estimated minimum waiting time for secure transactions. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Questions? We'll keep them short.
I noticed you went and said that reducing those timeouts may make it an issue to run a full node. Wouldn't that not apply, though, given that we're talking about blocks being fetched from a peer?
Yes, I think it would apply also to this setting. So we have seen that, we did some measurements with a Bitcoin node with 256 kilobyte downstream, 128 upstream, and that we actually reached a time of 20 minutes.
I guess what I'm saying is, if I'm running a full node on a bad bandwidth connection, the fact that you time out before you get my block isn't really a big deal, so long as if I do have a block that you don't have before, you still eventually get it, which I think would be true.
Yes, in this setting is true. For the fast node, it doesn't matter that much. It's more the slow node that will be affected. Yeah.
Any other questions? There's one in the back.
So about the results, did you pre-select the target, or was it on a random node?
No, we took 10 Amazon EC2 instances and just installed a vanilla Bitcoin client there and let it sync to the blockchain, and then we just we didn't change any parameters. What was default network settings, and we just connected to it.
No, what I mean is, so you're attacking a node. Do you pre-select which node you're attacking?
Sorry. Definitely, yes. Okay. So you have to know the IP address of the peer that you're targeting, right? Otherwise, so in the example of the double spending, for example, you need to know the IP address of the vendor in order to attack it. Does this answer your question?
No more questions? Okay, we'll go to the next session. Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. Excellent talk. Our next speaker is Jonathan Tumin, and we'll speak about BIP 101, block propagation data from the testnet.
Hello, Ni Hao. So my name is Jonathan. I'm a Bitcoin miner, and I'm also a mediocre C++ programmer and a neuroscientist and a few other things. I'm also on caffeine, so I'm going to be going pretty fast through this. I've got a lot of stuff to cover, so bear with me. So my perspective on scaling Bitcoin is that it's an engineering challenge. It's something that has problems. These problems are not impossible. They are somewhat complicated, but they can be fixed. And we just need to do the work to figure out how to fix each problem as it comes. My favorite proposal for how to scale Bitcoin is BIP 101. I like the predictability of it. I like the fact that it scales over 20 years. That's going to give us time to implement the software fixes that we're going to need in order to be able to really get Bitcoin to a large level. And also, I think that hard forks to increase the block size limit are hard, and soft forks are a lot easier. So it's a lot easier to decrease the limit or to put hold on the limit than it is to increase it. So I think that we should have the strategy of hard forking once or hard forking infrequently, and then doing progressive short-term limitations when we run into scaling problems. So in theory, what we would need in order to be able to handle, oh, by the way, BIP 101, let me just go back and say that. 8 megabytes now, or in January 11th, and then doubling every 2 years for the next 20 years, eventually reaching a size of 8,192 megabytes. That's what BIP 101 is. And that 8 gigabytes would require, in theory, a large amount of computing power, but it's not an insane amount of computing power. We would need about a 16-core CPU for like a 3 gigahertz per core CPU in order to be able to do the SIGOPS, the ECDCA signature validations that we would need in order to be able to validate the transactions. We'd need a fair amount of RAM. You'd need to be able to handle a few blocks worth of transactions in mempool, plus some overhead and some other stuff, the UTXO set, et cetera. And then the kicker, the hardest thing for us right now is actually the block propagation. And in theory, we could do that with a 1 gigabit internet connection. That would give us, it would take about 1 minute to upload an 8 gigabyte block. And you could use IBLTs or some other weak blocks, et cetera. You can use several things in order to be able to pre-transmit that data and only transmit a small amount of data when each block is found, basically the header and some other stuff. But there's a problem. Our code is not efficient. And that's particularly the case with the block propagation code. The RAM stuff, RAM usage is not too bad right now. CPU is okay, and it's going to get a lot better in a few months when libsec P256K1 is released. But the block propagation code itself is actually, in my opinion, really, really bad. And we can do a lot about that. And the effects of bad block propagation rates have already been talked about by Peter Todd and others. So I'm not going to go over it too much. But the quick idea is that currently China has 65% of the hash power. In actuality, not all of that hash power is running on servers in China because most of the Chinese pools have servers all around the world, and they do some of the block creation abroad and some of it domestically in China. But the Great Firewall is a big problem in terms both of performance and also just in theory. I mean, the purpose of the Great Firewall is to censor and to control information. And that has some problems for Bitcoin. So it makes me uncomfortable to have so much hash power subject to that system. Also, the problem for propagation over the Great Firewall may be asymmetrical with the current block propagation algorithm. I might talk about that, I might not, I don't know. It's not really that big of a deal. So we wanted to figure out how big of a problem this block propagation thing is, and we figured that Gavin had already done some tests using regtest mode, which is kind of like testnet but predictable. And I thought I would try to do something else. I'd try to make things unpredictable. I'd try to see what happens when all sorts of chaos is going on. So we chose to do it on testnet. We got about 21 nodes under our control, 10 under my control, and 11 from various users on Reddit. Mostly they were mid-range VPSs, but we had a few vastly underpowered machines too, a few NAS boxes running Intel Atom CPUs and stuff like that, just to see what happens. And our data collection method was different from most of the methods that I've seen in the past for measuring block propagation. Gmaxwell and the user Lightsword use Stratum to see when a block is being offered by mining pools, and they've done a lot of work on that. What we did was we started to monitor the debug logs, and we added extra debugging information to the debug logs to see when, with microsecond resolution, an env message was received, and all the other parts of the block propagation process happened on each node. And then we collected all those debug logs from our servers and did some central analysis. The data that we've got so far, I finished doing the analysis, or finished compiling yesterday at about 12 p.m. So there are a lot of tests that I still want to do that I haven't done. You're going to get a subset of our goal. Right now, we only have mining data using our London server. So everything that you're going to see is coming out of a London broadcast server. I hope to soon have a switch over to a Beijing server, but haven't done that yet. So maybe in a few days you'll be able to see some more varied data. Also, while we were doing these tests, we ran into a few bugs in our data, one of which was a Bitcoin XT specific bug that was in an unreleased version. It was only in the master branch, but we were using the master branch, so we ran into that. We fixed that about 2 days ago, 3 days ago, yeah. So the data before that is about 3 times slower in some circumstances than it should be. We also ran into a bug that affects, or it's not really a bug, but a performance issue that affects both Bitcoin Core and XT. And that's, actually there are 2 different variants of this, but they're both due to locking. The Git block template code locks CS main, and a bunch of other stuff also locks CS main. So if a node is mining, then all of the code that locks CS main can't run while you're creating a new block template. And in some circumstances, it can take 5, 12 seconds, 30 seconds to create a Git block template. So that's a huge amount of latency that you can add. One of the, well, yeah, I'll tell you about one of those issues in a few seconds. So here are the nodes that we had, just a quick look. So most of the top ones were mine. The ones below were contributed. Notice that we have 2 machines that use Intel Atom CPUs. So we were giving them 9 megabyte blocks and seeing how they did. Hint, not very well. So here's how block propagation works. The protocol starts with an env message, which is a way of saying that Alice, in this case, has a new block in her inventory. And she sends that to all of her peers. Typically, that's about 20 peers. It's usually 8 outgoing connections and then some number of incoming connections, maybe 12, maybe 20, maybe 40, who knows. So she broadcasts that message to everybody that she knows all at once. And then Bob will look, and if he has that block already, he'll ignore it. If he doesn't have that block, then he does 2 things in quick succession. First, he says, give me the headers. Tell me where in the blockchain that fits. And then immediately afterwards, he says, and give me the actual block data. One problem that we ran into is that the get headers function locks CS main. So if you are doing get block template, you can't actually submit the headers. You can't actually propagate the blocks until your get block template finishes. And one quick hack to get around this is to do get data, get headers, get data. So you send the actual block data first, and then you send the headers second to tell where it fits in, and then you have to send it again to handle a side issue. So Bob says get data usually, and then Alice says, here's the block. And then after that, after Bob receives the actual download, he still has to verify it. And when that completes, it finishes with an update tip message. So in our testing, we monitored the env message arrival at Bob's computer. We ignored the get data request, but we did collect that. And then we measured when the block message arrives, when the block is finished downloading. And then we finally measured when the block was actually added to the blockchain for Bob's machine. And we did this for all of our machines. We also collected some other data which we haven't analyzed yet. So on a macro scale, the block propagation looks kind of like this. You've got each computer that gets the block uploads to several different computers. Usually this is about 20 machines in parallel. Now, this means that no computer gets the block until after the machine finishes uploading to pretty much everybody at the same time. So for uploading a 1 megabyte block to 20 peers at 1 megabyte per second, it takes 20 seconds, not 1 second, before anybody uploads. So anyway, but you'll see this kind of line diagram where you can see the transmission time and the verification time in our data. All right, so that's it for the slides for now. I'm going to move over and I'm going to give you a quick hint about the severity of the China situation. So these are some of my nodes in China. This one is Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. And the ones below are my European nodes. I'm going to download a 8 megabyte file via HTTP from all of these nodes at the same time. And we'll see if it happens the way it usually has been. All right, so the European nodes are mostly finishing now. The last one is finished now. That was actually North America. And you can see that over here, Beijing is downloading at 200 kilobytes per second, and Shanghai is downloading at 50 kilobytes per second. A few days ago, Shanghai was faster than the rest. A few days ago, Beijing was faster than the rest. So this situation changes dynamically from day to day sometimes even from hour to hour. A few hours ago, Beijing was a lot faster than this. Now it's slow again. So obviously, if a node is only downloading at 30 or 40 kilobytes per second, you're going to have problems. And we did have problems. But only with the Chinese nodes. Anyway, so here's our tool. Oops, I should mention, please do not visit the URL that I just showed you, because this is running dynamically off of our web server, and I don't want it to get hugged to death until after the talk is done. So please hold off on visiting this for now. All right, so here's a list of the 50th percentile time for block transmission for each one of these machines. Some of them have an extra dot, so this one actually is using Mike Hearn's thin blocks patch. It doesn't seem to actually help that much. I think we still need to tweak it a little bit, but most of them don't have that. So you'll see the first dot is when it receives the env, second dot is when it finishes downloading, and then the third dot is when it finishes updating the tip of the blockchain to include that block. And you'll see that the times for most of these European and North American and non-Chinese Asian nodes are around 10 to 20 seconds, which is possibly tolerable, a little bit high, but not disastrous. And then if we go down to China, and also to one of our underpowered Intel Atom CPU machines, you'll see that things start to get really bad. Over here, we've got a scatter plot. Some of you might have seen the data that Gregory Maxwell collected. He found that if you're looking at stratum times, you see a block propagation time of about 10 seconds for a 1 megabyte block. And if you look at our data, you see about the same. So about 10 seconds for 1 meg on average. You can also see that there are like different groups. You've got the orange stuff with a steeper slope, and then you've got the green stuff with a shallower slope. So that's an indication of the distance mostly from the mining node, in this case London. So the orange is mostly Europe and North America, and green is mostly Asia, including China. You also see a lot of scattered off dark green stuff in the various areas. And then there's most of this data came from when we only had like one machine that wasn't one hop away from the mining node. So that one machine that was getting it on the second hop is actually this blue down here. If we go to time since that node saw the block instead of time since the block was mined, then we see the blue actually is mostly downloading it very, very fast because it's downloading it from a machine that is not overloaded. So anyway, so yeah, our data looks to be similar to what people see on mainnet for propagation through the whole network. But we're seeing that over one hop. And the reason that we're seeing those differences is that, sorry. Because I forgot the slides, right. Yeah, so we have fewer nodes, but the main effect is that we don't have the relay network. And the relay network is absolutely huge in the effect that it has. Also, I set these tests up with a few people off the internet in about 2 weeks, so things aren't exactly optimized. And we also have a bunch of Bitcoin Core nodes that are connecting to our nodes, and they're downloading blocks, but they're not uploading them, so they're just wasting bandwidth. So yeah, that's why we see the difference between the Gregory Maxwell data. We see the similarity between the G Maxwell data here and the data that we have over here. Yeah. Okay. So once you get around to it, you can play around with this. There's a lot of different options on here. But now we're going to get into the individual blocks. The ones at the top, we don't actually have data for all the machines just because of how long it takes to upload the multi-gigabyte log files. But down here, we've got data for most of our nodes. And you can see this gray line, by the way, is actually one of my Beijing nodes, but I just didn't have it named. Over here, we've got the Intel Atom CPU. So you can see it downloads the block quite quickly, but it takes about 70 seconds to validate it. And that's just because the CPU is totally insufficient for this task. And again, you see over here, so this node is in Germany. It received the block from a second London node, not the mining node, but just a nearby one, because the mining node didn't have that many connections. And yeah, it downloads the block in about 6 seconds, and in this case, it took about 22 seconds to validate it. These validation times will get a lot faster once we have libsec 256K1, but for now, they are quite a significant thing. Also, these validation times can be addressed by changing the way in which blocks are propagated. We can propagate unvalidated blocks by using a special bit to indicate that they're not validated, so SPV miners don't get them, or sorry, SPV wallets don't get them. Down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see sometimes these graphs show up like that, and that's the traffic for that node. And you can see that it's often very short and peaky. These machines tend to have pretty good internet connectivity, and also the algorithm that we're using for uploading these blocks doesn't use bandwidth efficiently. It just uses it for a very short period of time until it's uploaded to all 8 peers that it has, or 12, 20 peers, whatever. And after that, all of that bandwidth is completely wasted. If you connect to more peers, then you use bandwidth for a longer period of time, but the latency per block increases. So we've got like this nasty optimization problem that we don't need to have. Let's see, we can also look at the peer that uploaded to this peer by pressing Shift. And we can see when data was uploaded to that, and then when it started uploading data to the next peer. And there's quite a big gap in there, and that's basically the validation delay. So we can also use that empty space. You can use that time when the peer has the data, but hasn't started uploading it to anybody else because they haven't finished downloading the block and uploading it. If we look at the Chinese nodes, we see all sorts of crazy stuff going on. In this case, it took 160 seconds to download the block because bandwidth during the entire time was very poor. This is Shanghai again, which I showed the problems with doing wget. Let's see, there was one that I liked. Here's a thin block. Most of the traffic is actually afterwards. This is the bug in thin blocks right now, I think, that we need to track down. So I look at these and I see that most of the rest of the world can handle large blocks. They can definitely handle 2 megabytes. They can handle 4 megabytes. 8, 9 megabytes is starting to push it, but I think we can do it. China, though, cannot. And where did it go? And I think we need to do something about that. So here's some optimizations we can do to the Bitcoin block propagation protocol. We can move verification into a parallel path, so it's done asynchronously. We can also do a lot of data compression, like IBLTs, or weak blocks, or just sending the transaction hashes. That's a very simple optimization, instead of the full transactions and using them from mempool, and then doing back and forth to get them out. We can do all sorts of stuff. We can also start to upload in multiple directions once the first byte is received or the first chunk is received, and make it more like BitTorrent. I have a proposal called BlockTorrent for that. But the biggest thing I think we have is that we need to get the Chinese pools to take their block creation out of China. And we can do that using the Stratum protocol. We can still create the Coinbase transaction and stick that into the header in China, but we can do everything else with transactions outside of China. And this means that we only need 1 kilobyte or so of traffic across the Great Firewall, regardless of what the block size is. And I think this by itself can mostly fix the China issue that we're having. I'll be around in China for the next 20 days or so. If anybody wants to collaborate with me, I'm happy to do so. I will also be working on implementing BitTorrent, or the BlockTorrent, over the next couple of weeks. Work with me. Yeah, thanks. Here are people who helped. That's it. Questions?
Thank you, Jonathan. Question in the back.
Thank you. So, by the way, I have a lot of questions, but I will try to be short because it can become in the long discussion. So,
yep.
First of all, I'm pretty skeptical about increasing the block size for 8 megabytes. Everything what you have shown, it's pretty synthetical tests. So it's small network. Normally in Bitcoin network, on the statistics what I was collecting, the block propagation came in at least through 12 nodes. It's meaning if you have 1 megabyte block size and it's take 20 seconds to download, so you should multiply it to 12. So if you're increasing to 8 megabytes, it's meaning 120. If you're multiplying it, okay, at least for 5, so it's meaning it will be delay at least over 5-10 minutes, even in shortest one. So the next one, so if we are talking about the Bitcoin and blockchain, so increasing 8 megabytes, meaning 500 gigabytes per year for a blockchain. And we have a lot of limitation in the Bitcoin. I will just list 5 limitations in the Bitcoin, and my question is how you would like to solve it, because right now I'm thinking it's require a longer way, and XT doesn't solve it in short. But if you are able to reply on 5 questions, that's okay. So the mempool, the mempool size.
My talk is just about block propagation. I don't have time to address the other questions, so I would appreciate it if you'd restrict it to the block propagation.
Okay, if you are talking about block propagation, so did you perform the simulation for a biggest network? Because what you have shown, it's only tenths of nodes, but in real life, it's required for a normal simulation at least 500 nodes.
Yes, so we don't have the relay network. And so that's one difference between us and mainnet. The node count is another difference between us and mainnet. The relay network takes a much shorter path between mining nodes. So the distance between mining nodes in terms of the number of hops decreases, and also the size of the data that's sent likewise decreases. What I was trying to get at with the Maxwell data is that if you use that as a calibration factor to try to adjust for those two large opposing effects, you see that our block propagation data for 1 megabyte agrees mostly with mainnet's block propagation data for 1 megabyte. It's not the perfect answer, but that's the data that I have. Next question.
Yeah. My main question about large block proposals like this one is about the hardware, the storage hardware costs related to running a full node. So what is can you make an estimate about how that will develop with this proposal? And if you assume in that estimate that you only need to store the UTXO set, do you think it is wise to wait until we have UTXO set commitment before we do BIP 101? And if you assume Moore's law, can you go a bit more into the detail? Have you been thinking about what kind of hardware technology would be needed? And for instance, how many atoms do we need to store a bit?
So my two quick answers to that are checkpoints and pruning. Those can reduce the storage requirements for the blockchain by a large amount. There will still be a few people who want to store the whole blockchain, and they'll make it archivable and available for the general public. We also have quite a while before we get to the 8 gigabyte things. I don't know how ferromagnetic RAM and other technologies are going to progress. I suspect that with checkpoints and with, or even without checkpoints, but just with pruning, it'll be fairly cheap to run a full miner or a fully validating node, because those don't require the full history. They just require the UTXO set. And we already have some block pruning code in Bitcoin Core. It's just not quite done. Yeah, for the history, we don't need to store that at every single full node. We just need it for the people who want it Internet Archive. Yes?
We have another question back here first.
Okay.
First, I'd just like to say, please keep it to one question at a time and keep it pretty short. There'll be time to talk to the speakers later.
Yeah, I'm around for a long time. Talk to me. My email is not there. Whoops.
Go ahead and ask your question, please.
So at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about issues if we raise the block size.
Sorry, talked about what's?
There could be issues.
Issues, okay.
Yeah, but you didn't talk about what these issues are. And on a worst case scenario, what could happen?
So we ran into a couple of bugs or locking issues. There are performance issues in Bitcoin Core and also Bitcoin XT. One of the performance bugs was just in Bitcoin XT. It's fixed. There might be other performance issues. The main serious issue that we have is the issue that Peter Todd talked about in his talk that I felt no need to reiterate. That's when we have 65% of the hash power in a country with bad internet connections, that can cause everybody else to need to move to that place with bad internet connection just to remain competitive to have access to those blocks. And that's not good for decentralization. Does that answer your question, or is there something else? What could happen? Bitcoin could start a nuclear war somehow. I'm not sure.
How big of a UTXO set size were you testing with?
This was, let's see, the blockchain was 3.3 gigabytes when we started. I didn't look at the UTXO set size in particular. Sorry, can't answer that question. I can look into it.
Question here in the back.
It seemed like your blocks always were transmitted from London. Do you have any data where the blocks were generated in China? In particular, I'm a little concerned that we constantly think that the internet issue is something that circles China and doesn't pervade China, and those are two very, very different models.
Yeah, so I don't have data from mining in China yet. However, I can do a similar test, which I actually prepared for, in which I download the file from a Chinese node. Pick a city: Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, or Beijing. Shenzhen, okay. Good choice. Well, this isn't here. This is all of my notes. Oops, darn, I thought I had that.
Do you need the screen, Jonathan?
Oh, we lost it, darn. Okay, well, I'll just tell you. The Chinese nodes have all finished. We've got 26% on Washington. We just finished in Tokyo, London, and Newark. The bandwidth on the Chinese nodes was 3 megabytes, well, 2.6 megabytes up to 7.8 megabytes. 7.8 megabytes for Shanghai, which had the worst performance earlier. Now it's the fastest. Shanghai actually has good internet. It's just getting some packet loss from the Great Firewall. Washington had 515 kilobytes per second. Tokyo, 804 kilobytes per second. Singapore, still waiting. It hasn't even started downloading yet. 552 kilobytes for Newark and 980 kilobytes for London. Sorry about the loss of data. We were using TeamViewer to show my laptop. Next question.
We have one more question.
Hi, you say that you don't have the relay network and you're not able to test yet with like block compression, but like maybe it's actually more realistic to test without that, because then it is a lot closer to a adversarial situation.
Yep. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't include it. The main reason was laziness and lack of time. But I also did want to try figuring out situations in which it could break and see how it broke. And we did break it a couple of times, but not in any ways that we weren't expecting. Oh, by the way, we also hard forked testnet something like 6 times and also mined for about a day with slightly less hash power on the BIP101 fork than we had on the main fork. So it was basically just orphaning every block, and that's expected behavior for how a hard fork should work. So at least that one that works pretty well. All right, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Okay, next up is lunch. Are you guys excited about lunch? Yeah. Okay, lunch is going to be out to your right. So a quick announcement about lunch. It's going to be 1 hour and 20 minutes. We'll be back here before 3 p.m. for the miners panel. And for lunch, it's a brown bag lunch. So you get to pick up your own lunch and meet your colleagues and fellows. what happens is we're using these tags to assign colors. There are 4 topics. People can assign these choices. Essentially, if you are a developer, you could choose to put on an orange tag to identify yourself. If you're a miner, mining pool, use a green tag. If you're here for business related stuff, use a blue tag. And the press will have a purple tag. Okay, pink, purple. So pink is for press, orange for developers, green is for miners, blue is for general business. Please enjoy your lunch and be back by 2:50, 2:55 p.m. for the miners panel. Thank you. Yeah, for the tags, they'll be available out on the lunch tables out there. You can add them yourself or come to me quickly right here. Go ahead. Which one do you want? Just put the color tags on your name badge to identify yourself.